欢迎来到中经分析。中国拯救楼市系列举措，底离我们不远了。中经分析专栏作家李卫军。大约1周前，中国政府出台了一系列举措，力图拯救楼市。突发新闻：纽约陪审团在封口费审判中认定唐纳德·特朗普犯有多项重罪，使他成为首位被判有罪的前美国总统。特朗普在周四被判34项伪造商业记录罪名成立，这些记录是为了掩盖在2016年大选前向成人影星斯托米·丹尼尔斯支付的封口费。检察官称，特朗普主导了一项更广泛的计划，通过隐瞒他与女性的所谓性关系故事来影响选举。这项定罪为特朗普在面对现任总统乔·拜登的竞选之路上设置了艰难的法律和政治障碍。作为共和党推定的候选人，特朗普多次攻击此案为民主党干预选举，他可能被判多达4年的监禁，但他肯定会提出上诉，并可能在此过程中保持自由。特朗普否认与丹尼尔斯有染以及伪造记录。该判决是美国政治历史上最具影响力的时刻之一，迫使选民决定是否愿意让一名被判有罪的重犯入主白宫。然而，尽管特朗普有着法律和个人丑闻的历史，这位通过房地产积累财富的亿万富翁依然牢牢掌控着共和党。现年77岁的特朗普仍面临在华盛顿和佐治亚州的刑事审判，涉及他试图推翻2020年大选结果的案件，以及在佛罗里达州关于他未归还从白宫带走的机密国家安全文件的案件。然而，他的筹款和政治支持依然强劲，他在许多民调中领先拜登。如果当选，特朗普无法在封口费案件中赦免自己，因为他是因州级指控而非联邦指控被定罪的。判刑经过2天的审议，陪审团在5周生动的证词后做出了判决，这些证词吸引了全国的关注。曼哈顿地区检察官阿尔文·布拉格的团队辩称，特朗普利用特朗普集团的记录隐藏封口费计划，从而影响了2016年大选。特朗普先生和他的同伙在这个案件中所做的一切都是谎言。检察官约书亚·斯坦格拉斯在结案陈词中告诉曼哈顿的陪审员，证据真是压倒性的。主持审判的法官胡安·梅尔昌可能会判处特朗普监禁或给予缓刑，考虑到他的年龄和首次犯罪者的身份。梅尔昌在审判期间警告特朗普，如果他反复违反禁言令，可能会将他投入监狱。他还考虑了监禁一名前总统的安全要求。证据审判的核心围绕着特朗普的前律师和修理工迈克尔·科恩，他因作伪证和其他罪行入狱。科恩支付了13万美元给丹尼尔斯，以让他对其2006年与特朗普的所谓关系保持沉默。丹尼尔斯在2016年10月威胁要公开此事，那时通行好莱坞录音带曝光，特朗普在录音中讨论了性侵女性的行为。据科恩称，特朗普说，这是个灾难，完全的灾难。女人们会讨厌我。男人们可能觉得这很酷，但这对竞选活动来说将是个灾难。科恩作证称，他多次与特朗普讨论丹尼尔斯，特朗普批准了封口费协议。他说，特朗普授权一项计划，总共向科恩偿还42万美元，包括支付给丹尼尔斯的支票、支付给另一供应商的款项、税款分配和奖金。科恩告诉陪审员，他提交的发票虚假的标注为法律费用，而不是报销款。检察官说，34项伪造商业记录的指控涵盖了他的11张发票、11张支票以及12张公司凭证。尽管科恩受到严厉攻击，陪审团还是认定特朗普有罪。特朗普的律师托德·布兰奇攻击科恩是一个连续撒谎者，从爱特朗普到恨他，然后通过写书和播客谴责他的前老板赚了数百万美元。科恩是合理怀疑的化身，布兰奇说，迈克尔·科恩是最伟大的骗子。他真的是有史以来最伟大的骗子。尽管在审判前承诺会出庭作证，特朗普最终没有作证。然而，陪审员听到了一段科恩秘密录制的特朗普的录音， 看到了他的录像片段，并阅读了他关于科恩和丹尼尔斯的推文。审判亮点。检察官说，阴谋始于2015年8月在特朗普大厦举行的一次会议，会议由特朗普、科恩和国家询问报前首席执行官大卫·佩克尔参加。佩克尔作证说，他承诺充当特朗普竞选活动的眼睛和耳朵，发表正面文章并攻击对手。但更重要的是，佩克尔表示，他会在听到负面消息时通知科恩。佩克尔解释了他的公司美国媒体公司为何向前花花公子女郎卡伦·麦克杜格尔支付了15万美元，以让他对自己与特朗普长达1年的婚外情保持沉默。他说，他预计在特朗普竞选总统期间会有女性站出来讲述与他的故事，因为他被公认为最适合的单身汉，约会过最漂亮的女性。陪审员还听取了丹尼尔斯的证词，他详细描述了他在塔霍湖高尔夫锦标赛后在特朗普的酒店房间内与他发生的性关系。特朗普经常在竞选活动中和法庭外的电视摄像机前评论审判。梅尔昌发现，特朗普违反了一项禁止他评论陪审员、证人和检察官的禁言令。法官一度威胁说，如果特朗普再这样做，就把他投入监狱。前总统没有再次违反禁言令。唐纳德，特朗普因伪造商业记录以掩盖向一位色情明星支付封口费而被判有罪，成为首位被判重罪的前美国总统。由12人组成的陪审团一致裁定，结束了为期6周的审判。检察官指控特朗普策划了一场非法阴谋，以影响2016年总统选举。现在，特朗普在寻求再次当选总统时将背负犯罪记录。法官胡安·梅尔昌将在未来几周内决定特朗普的刑期。伪造商业记录的最高刑期为4年监禁，但由于该罪行是非暴力犯罪，且特朗普没有前科，因此监禁的可能性很低。梅尔昌可能选择居家监禁、缓刑或其他较轻的监督释放形式。法官还可能处以罚款或社区服务。特朗普肯定会对判决提出上诉，这一过程可能需要数月甚至数年。同时，他还面临另外3起案件的广泛刑事指控，2起涉及颠覆2020年选举结果，另一起涉及离任后囤积机密文件。但这些案件在选举日前开庭的可能性不大。政治影响。尽管这一判决具有历史性，但目前没有证据表明特朗普在封口费案件中的定罪会大幅改变他在2024年竞选中的前景。在许多摇摆州的民调中，他小幅领先于现任总统乔·拜登，这一领先优势在整个审判期间保持稳定。造成这种可能缺乏影响的一个原因是，这起案件的核心事件及其周边事件早已广为人知，《华尔街日报》在2018年首次披露了它们。由于审判没有电视直播，许多选民对法律程序的细节并不清楚。最近的民调显示，大多数美国人认为封口费案比特朗普的其他3起案件要轻微得多。昆尼皮亚克大学在5月中旬进行的一项民调显示，46%的受访者认为特朗普在封口费案中做了违法的事情，29%认为他做了不道德但不违法的事情，21%认为他没有做错什么。共和党内的特朗普盟友在整个审判过程中一直支持他，大批当选的共和党人和其他代言人在曼哈顿下城的法院大楼每天轮流陪伴他。选举前夕的支付。由7男5女组成的陪审团经过1天半的审议后做出了有罪判决。陪审团发现，特朗普伪造了反映他向前律师迈克尔·科恩支付的一系列款项的商业文件。这些款项用于偿还科恩在2016年大选前12天支付给色情明星斯托米·丹尼尔斯的13万美元封口费。当时，丹尼尔斯威胁要公开他与特朗普10年前的性关系。特朗普通过科恩作为中间人，与丹尼尔斯达成了保密协议，以确保他的说法不会损害他的白宫竞选。但当特朗普后来偿还科恩时，他在公司账簿上将这笔钱虚假地标记为法律费用。 曼哈顿地区检察官办公室的检察官指控特朗普34项重罪，指控他伪造了11份发票记录、12份总账条目和11张支票，其中一些支票是特朗普用黑色记号笔签署的。为了认定特朗普有罪，陪审团必须毫无疑问地认为特朗普是带有欺诈意图伪造了记录，而且他这样做是为了实施或掩盖另一项犯罪。检察官辩称，这一潜在犯罪是违反纽约州选举法，禁止通过非法手段推动候选人。检察官表示，支付给丹尼尔斯的封口费违反了竞选财务法。检察官还表示，特朗普对科恩的偿还安排违反了税法。特朗普否认有任何不当行为，长期以来将此案描述为骗局。早在2023年春季被起诉之前，这位前总统就声称调查是出于政治动机。在审判初期，他指责陪审员 95% 是民主党人。他还在几个月内多次攻击法官，称其为暴君，以及提起此案的当选民主党检察官曼哈顿地区检察官阿尔文·布拉格，称其为动物。他多次攻击案件中的证人，违反禁言令10次，被罚以蔑视法庭，罚款1万美元，并面临监禁的威胁。报协议与性丑闻审判为这一已广为人知的故事增添了新的细节，涉及该国顶级小报之一、一位总统候选人和一位色情明星。审判中出现了20位控方证人，其中许多人与特朗普有着长期且在某些情况下是肮脏的历史。国家询问报母公司美国媒体公司的前首席执行官大卫·佩克尔首次公开谈论了他在支付计划中的角色。他在2015年8月的特朗普大厦会议上与特朗普和科恩达成了协议，充当特朗普竞选活动的眼睛和耳朵。佩克尔作证称，他告诉两人他会发表宣传特朗普并诋毁其竞选对手的故事，这导致陪审团看到了一系列离奇的小报头条，例如本·卡森切开了我的大脑。佩克尔还表示，他同意在听到关于特朗普的负面消息时通知特朗普竞选团队，以便提前消除这些威胁。这一协议的第3部分，所谓的抓捕并杀死协议，导致了3次支付以消除潜在的特朗普负面故事。在特朗普的指示下，佩克尔作证称，奥米支付了其中2笔3万美元给一名前特朗普大厦的门卫，他正在出售关于特朗普私生子的故事。佩克尔认为这是假的。15万美元给前花花公子模特卡伦·麦克杜格尔，他声称与特朗普有1年的婚外情。第3笔抓捕并杀死协议是13万美元支付给丹尼尔斯的款项。科恩试图说服佩克尔支付，但佩克尔说他已经为特朗普支付了太多钱，因此拒绝了。案件核心，丹尼尔斯自己详细作证，描述了他在2006年塔霍湖高尔夫锦标赛期间在特朗普酒店套房内与他发生的性关系。特朗普否认丹尼尔斯的说法，在他作证时低声骂了胡说八道。特朗普的忠实支持者，2016年竞选和白宫期间为他工作过的霍普·希克斯作证，将特朗普描绘成一个家庭男人。他在证人席上对前老板表示支持，告诉陪审员，特朗普寻求压制丹尼尔斯和麦克杜格尔的指控是为了保护他的家人免受潜在的尴尬。但他最终也承认，特朗普曾对他暗示，他与丹尼尔斯达成协议是为了保护他的竞选。这一供述支持了检察官的论点，并使希克斯泪流满面。从修理工到对手，最关键的证词来自科恩，控方的明星证人。这位曾经的修理工变成了激烈的对手，他提供了3天半的证词，将他的前老板直接与丹尼尔斯和麦克杜格尔的交易以及偿还计划联系在一起。据科恩说，特朗普在前特朗普集团首席财务官艾伦·魏塞尔伯格在2017年1月的特朗普大厦会议上向他简要介绍了该计划后，亲自批准了偿还计划。因为科恩是唯一作证说特朗普直接指示他达成丹尼尔斯交易并授权偿还计划的证人，所以陪审团相信科恩对控方来说至关重要。同时，他也是最不可靠的证人。科恩带着自己的犯罪记录和其他信誉问题来到审判现场， 这位特朗普的辩护律师提供了丰富的交叉质询目标。在特朗普律师托德·布兰奇的质询下，科恩承认他打给特朗普的电话可能与丹尼尔斯交易无关。此外，科恩还承认，作为偿还努力的一部分，他从特朗普集团偷了6万美元。然而，陪审团没有听到案件核心人物的证词，特朗普本人。尽管他在几次场合暗示他会亲自出庭为自己辩护，但最终他选择了不出庭，避免了在交叉质询中面对一系列有损问题的可能。回顾2016年竞选，控方还带领陪审员回顾了2016年选举的最后几周。这一时期以通行好莱坞录音带的发布为开端，几位证人作证称，这引发了特朗普竞选团队的恐慌，并提高了他在女性选民中的地位警报，促使他试图与丹尼尔斯达成协议。尽管梅尔昌阻止检察官在法庭上播放录音带，但陪审员看到了特朗普吹嘘自己对待女性的录音带抄本。他说他可以抓住他们的下体，并看到了他在被指控性侵犯和骚扰女性后为自己辩护的视频片段。特朗普的律师只传唤了2位证人，一名律师助理和2018年与科恩协商的律师罗伯特·科斯特洛。尽管科斯特洛的证词旨在削弱科恩的信誉，但他在证人席上的不礼貌行为可能掩盖了他的说法，即科恩告诉他，特朗普与丹尼尔斯的支付无关。另一个失败与布拉格的胜利。前总统的刑事定罪是在一系列民事案件的法律失败之后发生的，包括1月份作家E. Jean Carroll 提起的诽谤诉讼中8300万美元的判决，以及2月份纽约州总检察长提起的欺诈案件中5亿美元的判决。对于继承特朗普调查并在面对包括民主党同僚在内的对起诉可行性表示怀疑的情况下，提起诉讼的地区检察官布拉格来说，这一判决可能是重大解脱和对其努力的肯定。尽管布拉格在公共场合对该案发表的言论很少，并且只偶尔参加审判，但他在12月与 WNYC 电台的采访中透露了他对该案的看法。核心不是为性付钱，布拉格说。我们会说这是关于阴谋破坏总统选举，然后在纽约商业记录中撒谎以掩盖这一点。
观众朋友们好，欢迎大家来到今天的华尔街论坛节目现场。那么我们在亚洲的朋友们啊，现在已经进入了6月，这个日子过得真是快啊！转眼间2024年好像要过到一半了啊。那么在这样的一个特别的节日，我们也特别祝福何明先生儿童节愉快。
是，谁是儿童，大家很清楚。
对，何明先生呢是童心未泯。我们说到这个每个人儿时的回忆呀，像我呀，因为我小的时候在中国啊，就会有这样的一个怎么说呢？对于儿时的我来说啊，是心里抹不去的阴影，就是看宫斗剧啊。当时呢有一部非常著名的连续剧，可能我这个年龄的中国的年轻人都看过，叫《还珠格格》，小杨不知道看过没有啊？其中呢就讲到一个非常坏的一个人叫容嬷嬷啊，拿针去扎这个女主角呀。我到现在一看到针，我都会想到那一幕啊。不过说到有关于《还珠格格》，可能啊给我这一代年轻人最大的一个知识的储备，就是清宫里面的各种各样的装饰以及宫名。那我们说到啊，近期北京出现了大风降温这样的一个情况，其中啊我们叫做坤宁宫啊，就出现了非常诡异的一幕。今天呢，小杨特别提及的这条新闻，又让我想到了儿时看《还珠格格》的方式。我已经想要介绍一下坤宁宫到底怎么了。
北京的这一场大风啊，我们之前有看到的是啊，这个在央视的这个像裤衩一样的建筑上呢，有一些这个清洁的工人他们是被吊在这个安全绳上，被吹的这个四处的摇曳。但是在几乎是同一时间呢，在北京的另一处地方，在这个故宫里大风造成的这个伤害或者是影响也在发生。这个是发生在北京时间的5月30日，在北京时间的这一天呢，这个大风是把故宫的这些坤宁宫的这些瓦片呢吹的这个四散，到处乱飞。那么我们现场也有一段视频展示的就是这样的一个景象。那么你在视频里也可以看到，那么视频中这个风大雨大，那么在这个故宫里有一些游客呢是用手机拍下了在故宫之内瓦片是被大风吹的连连摔落，落在地上破裂的声音呢，其实也被影片收录了，但是只是没有被这个导播给放出来。那不只是在故宫，那在北京的另外一处地方，清华大学里在这场大风过后，在社交媒体上，微博也传说北京有多棵古树被这一场大风拦腰折断。那么，如果稍微熟悉北京的清华大学可能这个有的观众都会有一点印象，就是在清华大学内部有不少株的这个上百年的古树这些古树是否也在这一场大风中遭殃那么根据北京大学这个清华大学的校内的一个现场的照片，确实，那在清华大学校门北侧的马路上确实是满目疮痍，地上呢全是树枝还有树叶等杂物虽然在现场也有人骑车前行但是你可以看到这个路面呢是被倒下的这些树枝呢给盖住了。还有照片显示，马路旁的一排树木倒下，横卧在马路上，有一些树呢更是被吹得连根拔起，马路上的水泥呢也被这个连根拔起，被连带着爆开。有照片还显示有玻璃门被摧毁，满目是玻璃碎片。网上呢除了这些树木被吹得连根拔起，这个坤宁宫故宫瓦片被吹掉的这些影像也是在网络上激起了很多的讨论万幸的是呢，这些掉落的物品没有砸中任何的游客。那首先再来跟进一下这些清华大学百年古树的安危。那么校门北侧有2棵树龄500年以上的桧柏是没有在这一场事故或者是这种极端天气中受到任何的影响，依旧是挺拔。那么周围的建筑和树木应该也是一个比较完好的状态。那这一次的大风灾害，估计严重损坏的2级古树包括榆树柏树松树，那也有一些其他的树木遭到了2次损坏的情况，那包括白杨泡桐槐树枫树等等。那可能这个古树就是古树这个百年古树，它的这个根确实是非常的牢，没有在北京的这一场10几级大风中受到任何的影响。
好，谢谢这个小杨的介绍 那我们说到这个妖风阵阵啊，近期何明先生这个
没，因为我们看了这种场景呢，大家可能觉得还是一个前国新闻，甚至我们在美国的讨论它，但是作为一个长岛居民来讲，这个简直是不算什么了。
这也是我想说的。
第一，长岛就是妖风比较多啊，我们是岛上嘛。第二个呢，就是这个因为是急沙或者是冲沙所形成的这么一个岛屿，所以它的这个泥土还是比较浅的，所以呢这个树根它不那么扎实。不过我家里还是有一棵树，也许也是一个古树，要几个人才围得住啊。那一次大风的时候真的是就倒了以后，房子里面很多孩子都是留学生当把我吓坏了，幸亏倒到别人面子里去了。后来政府来赔偿赔偿很简单，谁把这个树拉走5000块美金
那5000块可能是当时的价钱。我呢，在波士顿的这样的这个房子里面也是有过这样的一个情况。那有一棵树呢是倒下了，我是才知道在美国呀，要是妖风把你的树吹倒了，你要请人来上门把这个树要锯掉，要处理掉这个，而且这个树枝什么还要当场绞碎。这一部分的钱呢，当然是。最后是保险公司来出，但其实你要承担相当的一部分了。
对。
那么除了这样的一个情况之外呢，那个树一倒就把这个电线给压坏了，所以一个街区是出现了停电这样的一个状况类似这个不管是大雪压城还是妖风阵阵
但是大家应该有一个最起码的安全常识。我相信我们所有的观众都知道下雨的时候刮风的时候，千万不要站在树底下。
不仅仅是树底下也不要站在房屋底下，像我们这个坤宁宫直接刮瓦片这一种那也不比站在树底下来的安全在哪里。我们就说不知道到底是不是因为气候变化的问题，现在好像全球这种极端的气候是越来越多了我们在东部呢，这个经常是突然出现高温在纽约没有出现过的高温。那在西部更不用说了，野火连连那么今天又是北京妖风阵阵那么不知道到底是怎样的原因。时代变化的快。那么我们非常关注的科技行业变化的也快。昨天呢，我就特别注意到有国际媒体的报道，就是字节跳动现在可能会采取一个全新的路线转变的方式，由做短视频变成做 AI 助理这样的一个方式，以求在 AI 的战线重新夺回科技企业，特别是中国本土产生的科技企业的王冠这样的一个宝座。而我们说到，在科技巨头行业不管是阿里也好，还是京东也好，这些传统的电商巨头现在看起来都有一点暗淡，有一点失落。那面对科技行业的转型，现在京东到底怎样改变路线呢？那之前呢，我们在节目中为大家介绍到刘强东本人似乎是很着急，最近有怎样的最新举措呢？看来是要开源节流了，但是节流却引起了相当大的社会争议，能不能介绍一下？
这是最近这个刘强东的话题呢是不断。那么一向把自己的员工称为兄弟的刘强东这个突然是在最近似乎是变脸了，讲了一番狼性的这个发言，说业绩不好又从来不拼搏的人从来不是我的兄弟。那对于秉持生活第一、工作第二价值观的这个员工刘强东也说。你没有错，我只能说你就是路人，不是兄弟。那这番讲话是源自于刘强东在5月24日这个618购物节前夕的一个高管会议内部的讲话。那经过媒体曝光他的这样的讲话在网络上是引起了非常多的讨论。当然了，这个很多讨论是比较负面的。而关于刘强东最近的这个争议性的事件呢，也不少。除了这个他的讲话之外呢，就是京东的这些员工了。那在社交媒体上有一个自称是在京东年薪100万的女高管发帖说，她在40岁的年纪被裁，年薪100万一夜归零，从这个签字到走人只有半天的时间。那根据他的这一番自述他说这一次被开是刚过完老员工日，隔了一天自己就被通知去会议室签字，一切呢很顺利。赔偿合理，股票完结从签字到走人半天结束。而谈及自己在京东做了8年的这个经历，这名这个自称是京东女高管的人就说仿佛是一场婚姻，从蜜月期相互信任，给机会带团队，给升职，给加薪。但是自从自己生完2胎之后，在这个办公室似乎是遭遇了这个职场的霸凌，加薪无望，绩效呢也拿不到这个 A、B 了，只能拿到 C， 而且是和同事这个同僚之间相互消耗，如同鸡肋啊！铁打的营盘流水的兵，在职场上每天都有新人加入，也有人主动或被动的离开，这个呢其实是很正常的一个现象。但是啊，这个在一些中国的这些互联网行业，像京东啊、阿里啊这些公司啊，那常常呢你就可以在网络上听到一些这种比较离奇，或者是说令人感到这个非常匪夷所思的一些故事。那么这个40岁的女高管100万年薪一夜归零呢，也只是其中之一。这个也只是一个对。讲了，
讲了，
都
没头没尾啊，
都讲到我们的心头上去了。因为你不要说中国发生的事情了，华尔街的这些人呐，这个可以说一辈子读名校，好不容易进入华尔街是100万高薪也有可能，对吧？马上豪宅，然后过上美国的5%或者1%的这个生活，突然之间你走人，拿到一个纸箱子离开那么一个辉煌的华尔街的时候。你觉得怎么样？
的确啊，我们不要说华尔街了，就说我们所在的这个行业啊，《华尔街日报》昨天呢又是进行了一轮大裁员啊，听说是东部的西部的以及整个报道美国事务的新闻室是遇到了非常非常严重的一轮裁员啊，到了什么程度呢？那么不要说这个《华尔街日报》工会的成员啊，就是一些记者现在呢开始对他们这个主编就是 Emma Tucker 表达不满，用这个 sticky notes 就是彩色的贴纸啊，在这个主编的这个办公室外面的玻璃墙上贴满了对于他的控诉啊。后来实在没有办法了，是这个主编的这些这个助理啊，出来说你们这样做，你们要在我身上贴吗？做这样总之呢是非常的不愉快。那我们也知道，昨天呢其实是一个新闻相当密集的一天，特别是有关于这个川普前总统的审判问题啊。但是在这样的一个情况下呢，整个新闻室的员工拒绝和这个编辑部进行合作啊。听说呢，现在关系闹的是十分的僵硬，特别是这一次裁员呢，涉及到了很多报道美国国内政治以及国内安全问题的记者啊。这一部分呢，一直被认为是整个《华尔街日报》的中坚力量啊，其中不乏名记者。这一次呢，也是遭遇到了裁员的危机。当然，我们说这个《华尔街日报》这一位主编的做法手段之凌厉，其实在内部是有一些争议的。但是这也反映了整个这个新闻行业在这个变迁中所面临的这样一个非常痛苦的一个转型阶段啊。不过说到了这个新闻行业，说到了昨天的大新闻，咱们是不是就继续说一说前总统川普定案的有关事实？那么这个小杨能不能跟我们先介绍一下新闻到底是怎样的？
如果你昨天有一直在看这个美国的新闻这个 CBS 或者 CNN 你可以看到这个电视主播呢会用这样的一个方式来形容川普41项罪名成立的这样的34项罪名成立的这样一个事实，就是说我们已经走入了一个史无前例的情况。确实昨天确实是历史性的一天。那么如果你一直有在看这个川普被定罪的这个事呢，你会知道在昨天，也就是5月30日的美东时间的5月30日的下午5点那随着这个陪审团的一名代表翻过34页，把每一项罪名说他是罪名成立呢。那川普是成为了美国历史上第一位被判定为犯下重罪的前总统。那么这个事情其实发生在我们昨天下班前后，交接班前后那我自己呢是有一些手忙脚乱，但是很快呢，这个大量的信息就涌入到了我们的这个信系统之中。那在这一次呢，首先关注的是川普的这个。他在这一次大概是6周时间的审判。那么在6周时间的审判，其实关于就是这个整个审判的名字就叫做纽约州诉川普。那这个判案的核心呢，就是川普在2015年前后，在他的上一次的这个总统竞选中上上次的总统竞选中，关于和一名成人女星就封口费事宜展开的一个怎么说呢？一个不太能搬得上台面的这样的一个故事。那么在5月30日的下午，在封口费案中遭刑事起诉的这个前总统川普呢，被陪审团一致裁定有罪。刚才也说了，他的被控的34项伪造商业记录的重罪的罪名是在一审中全部成立。那我们在昨天在讨论这个时候的时候，也 我们也由一个现象呢，提前是大概率判定川普会被判定有罪，就是陪审团用的时间非常短，就达成了一个一致的决议。那么川普在听到有罪一词被陪审团主席当庭宣读34次时，川普本人是坐在被告席上，而被形容为是神色阴郁又木然。那至于接下来的量刑环节呢，则要等到1个多月后。川普的判决时间呢是在7月11日。在此之前呢，那将先由一名缓刑官针对被定罪的川普撰写一份这个缓刑报告，作为法官量刑的参考。而这份报告的起草时间呢，也需要4至6周的时间。那在川普于7月15日的美国共和党全国代表大会上被正式提名为2024年美国总统选举共和党提名人的4天前，他面临的刑罚呢将会公布。对于一审的结果那很多媒体都表示，或者是预测，川普的团队呢会在30天内提出上诉。那在美国的这个宪法中是没有明文规定说如果被起诉或者是被定罪，甚至是入狱服刑状态的人不能美国公民不能竞选或当选美国的总统。而对于在纽约州犯有刚才提到的这个伪造商业记录罪名的重罪犯，最高可判4年的监禁。但是在昨天川普的这个判决出来之后有很多这个法律界的人士就开始讨论，或者是给出了一些建议，认为鉴于川普目前也是77岁的一个高龄，而且之前没有刑事犯罪记录，法官很有可能对川普处以罚款，或是强制川普参加社区服务。就是说很可能川普是不会真的是穿上一身囚服在监狱里度过一段时间，但是这也只是一种推测。那有外界判断说法官也许会判处川普在他的佛罗里达州的这个海湖庄园居家监禁半年到1年的时间，或者呢是处于缓刑。那如果被判缓刑呢，川普需要向缓刑官申请去州外旅行的许可，也可能会随时遭到搜查和传唤。那么这个在法官量刑的时候呢，法官考虑的因素包括这么几点，那包括川普仍在角逐美国的大选，如果川普是被完全的监禁，将难以参加竞选集会，包括和拜登进行这个电视辩论等等的活动。如果就是假设川普在今年的11月再次胜选，那川普履行总统职务时，也可能会和这个所可能的服刑产生冲突。川普的罪名呢是非暴力的罪行。作为美国的前总统，川普依然是享有美国特勤局人员的全天候的保护。可以想象的是，如果川普入狱那么他的随行的这些特勤局的安保人员，那和这些监狱的管理者、狱警之间，是不是会产生一些管理上的冲突，或者是一些各自需要完成各自的工作，就此产生的冲突这个是很难根据以前的经验来进行任何的推测的，因为这样的事情在之前呢是从未发生过。所以在昨天我看了很多美国电视媒体的报道，他们都是正如我刚才所说的，是用了这样的一个词来形容这一次的判决是我们是走入了一个史无前例的时刻。
好，谢谢小杨的介绍，革命先生。
之所以说是走入一个史无前例的一个时刻这句话用得非常好的原因就是它不是一个案件的了结，而是一个政治撕裂和美国信任司法的信任和尊严遭到猛烈抨击的这样一个攻击的一个时代我们不能说美国的社会从此就走向了一个崩溃，但是美国的社会是第一次真正面临一个信任，一个这个尊严一个体面的时代是不是已经结束了？因为在很多反对川普的人看起来，昨天是欢欣鼓舞的一天。一个前总统最终是因为他的罪行被判了刑，而且是重罪，不管为了坐不坐牢但是对于川普的支持者，这是一次政治司法的滥用是一个没有司法公平的一个审判。所以川普公开说，这个审判纯粹是一个政治迫害，我是一个政治犯，大家到11月5号才能呢做真正的这个了结。 这等于呢是给川普未来如果司法的定罪奠定了一个非常糟糕的一个基础。我们知道法官在进行量刑的时候一个是缓刑的这个理由社团认识川普的法拉盛的人我从小就看他长大的是个不错的孩子，或者是曼哈顿的这个基金商川普从来付款很及时很不错，对吧？也没有这个其他的暴力犯罪这是首次犯罪然后呢，他有悔改的意思，法官一看这不错对吧？就给予量刑就澄清。但是问题是，川普在整个的司法的审理过程中间，一方面他作为一个被告，必须很谦卑的坐在那个地方，但是另一方面他的公开的言论是挑战了法庭，不但是对法官进行了攻击，而且对检察官也进行了侮辱，甚至呢也嘲笑这个陪审团。按照司法的实际的话呢，这个叫重上加重。所以看这个美国的司法，我昨天看了很多律师他们都只是讲了事情的一方面，其实它是互相交杂在一起，有轻判这个川普的1万条理由，同时也可以重判川普的1万条理由，这就说明了美国的司法政治面临一个考验。那么现在我们所有的人都已经知道了他可以继续这个参选这个总统，也有可能呢会选得上这种几率也是非常之大不能说是，至少不是说是0或者20，对吧？但是对于美国的信誉，对于美国的政治，面临一个80年代像我们这种对民主、对自由充满着无限的想象，民主有纠正机制，法律有公平的时候，实际上面临一个真正的考验不是说回过头来说专制比民主更好，而是民主确确实实出了这个问题。这些问题我们看到不仅是这个美国的民主出了问题，其实欧洲的情况一点都不轻可以说是相当的严重。像我们的年轻人应该是更有朝气，更有包容心，但是现在各种数据显示出来，欧洲的极右的倾向是得到很多年轻人的支持，而美国的撕裂这一次比当年的克林顿时候的这个是完全不同的性质。克林顿时候的所谓的拉里门事件，到小布什时候的选举的佛罗里达的争议，到这个奥巴马这个一要成为一个美国的总统，那个时候还是隐藏在后面的种族主义，隐藏在后面的这个社会的撕裂、不信任，而今天昨天就已经一切公开了这个确确实实是一个新的时刻。但是这种新的时刻是给美国带来一个更灿烂的未来，还是说美国就面临的一个很难逾越的一个障碍？我们还继续看。但是昨天这个刚刚李奇博士讲一个事情，实际上是令人很心酸的，就是说今年的美国政治应该进入一个高潮期一个如此的激烈的一个时刻，应该由这些优秀的记者进行报道。但是事实上，美国的民众关注度非常之低这个的审判，整个在美国的民调的关注率大概只有16%。而在这个时候，应该有更多的优秀记者报道今年的大选。但是像《华尔街日报》这样世界上最顶尖的媒体都是裁员，其实其他的媒体，我告诉大家，基本上垮掉了，尤其是地方性的媒体。其实美国也面临到另外一个问题，就是媒体的危机。而这些危机，像《华尔街日报》，这只是一个开始而已。未来等的都是关门，还是等到的转型？我是认为他们作为一个互联网的幸存者，能不能在人工智能的这样一个过程中间能够生存下来，其实是非常值得怀念的、担忧的
好，谢谢这个和平先生的点评那么今天呢，在稍后的6度解析栏目中我们要为大家带来的是来自彭博社的一篇观点文章是出自于裴敏先教授之手。他其中就特别讲到了一点，就是说美国和中国现在其实都面临某一种困惑，美国需要打败中国，但是美国同时也需要避免成为另外一个中国那么其中呢，也表达了对于美国民主的一些担忧。稍后呢，我们会在6度解析中为大家进行更加详细的介绍。 再要说到近期的大事啊，还有就是中国的国防部长董军首次正式亮相。那么我们也收集了很多啊，董军先生这一次在新加坡香格里拉峰会与美国的五角大楼的主管国防部长奥斯汀先生的会面的现场的相关的情形。不知道小杨有没有关注到相关的新闻啊？这一次董军在香会的表现有哪一些可圈点之处？
首先是一个不能说得上出乎意料的一个小新闻吧，就是说本来这个董军和奥斯汀之间呢会面的时间预计是1个小时，但是在会面结束之后这个整个的时长从1个小时变成了1个小时10分钟多了10分钟。那这个是谈的比较好呢，还是这个谈的比较差呢？那根据奥斯汀的在离开会场时，他在面对媒体镜头的时候呢，大致他说了一句话，说他这个谢谢大家的关注，我们谈的还行。那董军这边也说谢谢大家的关注，一会儿我们的同事会向大家介绍情况。那么随后呢，这个在美国国防部的官网上出现了这个奥斯汀的一个声明，那大致是这么说的：这个奥斯汀说，我和这个中国的防长董军在新加坡香格里拉对话进行了一个见面，那讨论呢就是美国中国防务关系以及地区的全球安全的问题。那根据这一篇发表在五角大楼上的这个讲话的一个读稿，奥斯汀是强调这个美国和中国两国军事沟通渠道顺畅的重要性他也说了，这个拜登总统和中国国家主席习近平在2023年11月宣布的两国将在未来几个月恢复战区指挥官之间的电话通话，也说很期待年底前召开一个危机沟通工作组的计划。同时呢，这个奥斯汀也是对这个台海两岸这种挑衅活动的担忧，也说这个中国不应以台湾政客过度正常民主程序的一部分为借口采取这些胁迫的措施他说美国仍然是致力于长期的一中政策，这个政策也是以台湾关系法、中美3个联合公报和6项保证为指导。他是再次强调了台湾海峡的和平与稳定的重要性。那另外一方面，奥斯汀也说美国将继续在国际法允许的地方安全负责的飞行、航行和活动。他也强调了这个尊重国际法保障的公海航行自由的重要性，尤其是在近期或者是说过去一段时间非常成为这个媒体焦点的南中国海地区。而对于这个俄乌战争他说的呢，在这一篇稿子里比较少。奥斯汀只是讨论了俄罗斯对乌克兰的战争，以及中国在支持俄罗斯国防工业基地一些国防工业建设方面的角色。那么奥斯汀也提到了朝鲜的情况，他说对朝鲜最近的挑衅行为表示关切，那包括对这个把这些和俄罗斯达成一些军事合作，向俄罗斯持续输送弹药，为这个俄罗斯入侵乌克兰呢支持俄罗斯入侵乌克兰等等等等。看来今天的这个主要的核心的议题就是美中之间这个一些直接沟通渠道保持高频率沟通的一个重要性。但是这篇稿子呢，还是怎么说呢？还是比较是概括性的，并没有特别多的细节。那不知道和平先生怎么看美方的这一篇通稿，或者是这个一篇声明
无论是美国的声明还是中国的声明，其实所有人都认同这一点只不过是呢，因为被伤害的美国的和中国的这种军事交流回到一个正常的一个交流的轨道，也就是这一次的主要是各自表示一下立场，握个手。下一步最关键的是两军之间要建立一个基本上的避免这样的误判的一个机制对吧？你打我，我打你，还要先通知一下，对吧？不要这样这个来小动作，开玩笑。更重要的是不要进行这个误判。如果美中之间只要不进行这个误判这一点产生的话呢，那我们基本上就可以判定呢，美中之间不会在亚洲发生真正的这个战争。因为今天的战争在大国之间，你一个意义上 已经不具有战争的意思。这就是为什么俄罗斯侵略了这个乌克兰，北约也只是喊一喊，叫一叫，到后面提供炮弹，让乌克兰成为炮灰，自己是不能上战场的。你美国用这个对乌克兰使用什么武器装备的北加限制，大家都知道，一旦跟俄罗斯真正的交战，就是世界毁灭之战。美中之间的这样一种交战已经进入到一个什么程度我们回顾一下这个几十年以前，今天早上我跟一位朋友聊天，聊到了我们共同的朋友，当时是哥伦比亚大学的一位教授，就是大家很熟悉的史学家唐德刚先生。当时的校长是谁校长是艾森豪威。艾森豪威大家知道是这个二战之后的美国的最重要的这个司令员。他从司令员下台之后当哥大校长，当哥大校长之后又去当这个总统。他有几番话还是蛮有意思的尤其是他不再担任总统之后的那趟话，实际上是意味着美国为什么在战争的漩涡中间很难走出来的一个根本原因。不过今天要讲的是，他当时在哥伦比亚大学的时候回答了一个问题，说我们什么时候去打中国？你看艾森豪威就伸出了一个手指，别人就问他，一个集团军？不会吧？艾森豪威告诉大家，一个师就可以把中国搞定。这就是几十年之后唐德刚教授还是如此的回顾当时他们的校长的强化，如此的狂妄，如此的轻狂。几年之后在韩战就已经回答了美国人。中国人觉得没有想到，中国军人用血肉之躯跟世界上最强大的军队进行了一个拼搏。虽然今天有很多的报道披露出来，中共在这个朝鲜战场上的很多的掩盖的事实，但是从国际关系来讲，其实一个平衡的亚洲就已经开始了。实际上这一点就根本就从此就没有改变过。越战也好，后来的阿富汗战争也好，都没有改变亚洲的均衡。实际上今天的亚洲是一个相当和平的一个亚洲，但是对于军火商来讲对于那些战略幻想狂来讲，他们希望亚洲这一次成为战争的这个战场，因为否则的话他们的军火消失到哪里去了？否则的话他们吃什么饭呢？所以作为亚洲人来讲，作为美国人来讲，作为中国人来讲，应该警醒这一点。今天的军人走向这个谈判台上就是一个糟糕的信号，因为文官不行，武官在上场，但是呢，武官至少可以交流，而不会走向战场。这也许呢，我们还是有一根弦要警惕这些事情，要被那些小心被那些军火商们、那些战略诡计们把亚洲拖进到这个战争的火坑，因为没有任何理由，美国和中国在亚洲进行所谓的战争。
好，谢谢这个何明先生的介绍。那么我们请导播再回到刚才我们看到的相会现场的这张照片呢，有网友说这个新加坡的这个接客之道有一点奇怪为什么桌上摆的是纸盒的牛奶呢，不是水呢？实际上如果你有在新加坡生活的经验，你就知道这呢就是新加坡著名的叫做新生水New Water。那么也请导播放上这个新生水历代包装盒的这个照片。那么现在看到右边的这个呢是最新款的这一种，就是我们叫做保鲜盒的这一种新生水。那为什么这个新生水被认为是新加坡的标志呢？那我们知道新加坡是一个没有淡水的一个国家，基本上整个全国人民所使用的淡水全部要依赖从马来西亚进口。那怎么办呢？实际上新加坡在这个之前的几十年中就一直在投资做一种技术这种技术叫 MBR， 那么这个学名叫做沉浸式薄膜技术，实际上就是新加坡人的生活污水、工业污水都要经过2次的这样的一个排清。第一呢是有一部分去污化或者是去毒化之后要排向大海，还有就是要重新利用。重新利用的标准不是像我们想的这个叫做次水可以用来冲马桶等等等等，就是可以喝的水，就是新生水所以呢，这个我记得这个李显龙的夫人何晶也曾经是说我们这个新加坡如果我们是 有一半的水可以再重生的话，实际上我们相当于我们的供水量就是2倍了。如果我们有70%的水能够通过这种再生技术能够再重新使用的话，相当于我们的水量就是4倍啊。所以这也体现出了像新加坡这样一个资源非常非常贫乏的一个小国啊，是怎样借助于新技术啊，实现某一种资源能源的独立。所以大家看到这个桌上这个蓝色的盒子啊，这不是牛奶，这是新加坡著名的新生水啊。
非常感谢这个李奇博士介绍一个日子的背景，我听起来都是非常的感慨啊。因为当马来西亚宣布啊这个不要新加坡的时候，那个时候对于李光耀真的是眼泪都流下来了，因为水都没有啊，水都要靠马来西亚呀。所以新加坡啊，我们知道小国无外交，小国无经济，甚至你可以来讲。但是新加坡这个地方不但在外交思想来讲，现在对全世界树立了很好的样本，而且他们在经济上成为亚洲最重要的这样一个经济体，真的是为新加坡人感觉到非常的骄傲。所以看了这个水，我都很感动。
那么这个我们这个去新加坡这个上学的时候啊，也有呢这样的我们叫做实地交流、实地考察是什么呢？就是去新加坡的新生水厂啊，去樟宜的新生水厂，要听现场的科学家来讲啊，这个技术到底是怎么回事？当然具体的技术是怎么回事，我已经想不起来了，我就记得新生水的这个包装盒。
因为我们也去过水厂参观，以为都是把漂白粉扔到里面去，消一下毒就喝了。
对，的确，我们现在想到节约用水，在美国也基本就是说这个中水呀，实际上是不符合其他饮用标准，你就是冲一冲厕所2次利用而已啊。但在新加坡的这个污水和工业污水，它真的是可以变成是可以喝的水啊。这就涉及到我们今天要讨论另外一个话题，就是可再生能源。说到可再生能源，大家想到了电动汽车，说到电动汽车，又想到了中国现在和欧盟和美国之间的贸易争端。今天早些时候啊，我们特别为大家介绍到了来自 Politico 的独家报道，习近平有5页纸的停战修和书已经是送到了欧盟的贸易专员啊，现在这个的桌上。那么欧盟表示啊，我们现在已经收到了，现在呢，我们很快就要给你写回信了。那这5页的休战书到底讲述了怎样的内容呢？小杨能不能给我们介绍一下？
这根据 Politico 的报道啊，就是在大概这个习近平的5页休战书的内容讲的就是我们这个和我们中国和欧盟之间的这个关系呢。不应该再被这样没有理由的贸易战呢拖延下去了。那么根据 Politico 的这一份报道，他们提到的是来自中国的这一份5页的这个休战书啊，讲的就是好比说欧盟这边呢，他们是对中国有一个非常大量的一个农业的出口。如果没有记错的话，这个欧盟向中国输出的这个农业呢，在他们的这个排名中是排第3的。而这样的一个比例呢，就让包括中国或者是欧盟，他们各自的一些在欧盟内部这个各自的这个从事农业的这些农民嘛，他们就对中国和欧盟之间的这种所谓的贸易战感到非常的恼火。中国政府现在呢是已经向欧盟的这个贸易负责人发出的长达5页的信函，呼吁在正在开展的贸易战，我们还是赶紧休战。而刚才李琦也提到了，这个欧盟也正在起草回信。那么根据我们看到的相关的内容这封信中讲的就是这么几点，一个就是飞机空客，第2个就是刚才所说的农业。中国威胁说如果欧盟不放弃对中国电动车征收关税，那么中国将采取措施打击欧盟的航空和食品出口，就是空客和这个农产品的出口了。那么根据知情人士透露这封信明确表示，中国政府对欧盟行政部门近几个月来发起的贸易调查步伐加快感到非常的恼火，也希望停战避免这个贸易战进一步的升级。现在的资料是中国是欧盟农业食品出口的第3大目的地，也占欧盟农业食品贸易总额的6.4%。那在欧洲农民可能大家的定义是这个看起来很土，或者是说看起来这个乡巴佬一样的感觉。但是如果说你有关注过去一段时间欧洲的新闻那么农业上的一些所谓的各类的罢工或者是说在政府门前这个农民他们对于政府的声讨你可以看到在欧洲这个农民的声势，或者是说他们的势力，或者是说他们的 一种团结或是勇气呢，是完全不能小觑的。这个在欧洲啊，农民可以说是重中之重的一股这种力量吧，或者是说和我们这种作为从在中国的这种农民的概念呢，和在农民在欧洲的概念是一个不能说天差地别吧，但是
还是中国农民厉害。中国农民把共产党送到这个北京城，你不能说中国农民不厉害，只是进了北京城以后把农民给压迫下去了。因为共产党知道你把我送到朝廷，你也可以把我干掉朝廷，所以从此以后共产党打压这个农民就成为了他的既定政策，到现在为止都没有根本性的扭转。讲到农民的厉害啊，实际上是除了中国的农民厉害，印度的农民也高厉害的。印度的农民包围政府，组织政府的很多的行为搞了很长时间，这是大家没有注意到一点。当然，在欧洲的农民里面最厉害的还是法国农民。法国农民开着拖拉机，开着汽车开到了巴黎，对吧？
对，
把汽车烧毁，把道路给好像餐馆还被扔了这个燃烧弹。厉害啊！这就是现在的这个政治的一个特点。虽然欧盟的这个领导人呢，称不得意识形态或者称不得传统的观念，但是呢，欧洲自己的这个经济团体未必骂他的账啊，农民粮食卖给谁啊？对不对？德国的工业产品卖给谁啊？最重要的是违背了西方，尤其是欧洲人自己口声声讲的是自由竞争、法治。不要说这个中国的这些媒体了，没什么用啊！你去看看德国的一些教授，经济学教授一个一个出来写文章，你这种做法是完全是政治做法嘛？你违背了最起码的这个市场嘛？你需要有一个非常明确的证据，证明中国用低廉的价钱撑垮了你欧洲现有的这个产业，比如说你的电灯泡，对吧？你欧洲自己也生产电灯泡1块钱一个，结果呢，中国的政府补助这个电灯泡变成1毛钱一个。那这个是叫春销，这个是到商业的影响。问题是你自己的新能源在哪里啊？你根本没有嘛！而且新能源是全世界政府都是鼓励政府来支持这个新能源的产业啊。中国政府帮助你搞了这个新能源工业，你还追着管春销，天底下哪里有这样的道理啊？这样的混账的这个欧盟领导人呢？不过呢，我们应该赞扬习近平求和是对的。习近平现在最近讲的有些话我们不以为然，但是和为贵是很重要的。天底下跟任何国家要尽可能的和为贵何况呢，欧美之间现在欧洲和中国之间各有所求，那么这等各有所求呢，就为和为贵奠定了一个基础现在欧盟呢现在初步的决定也是要到他们的选举之后才能做出这个决定。现在搁置下来了，我看这个制裁互相制裁都是互相自残都不会有什么好果子吃。
好，谢谢这个何明先生的点评刚才我也特别注意到，我们一提到欧盟有这样的一条突发新闻就在前几天的时候呢，马克龙总统实际上是表示了他希望欧盟的下届主席要这个意大利的德拉吉来做这样一位金融界的一个人士，而不是再由冯德莱恩来做。那么马克龙呢，在冯德莱恩的第一个任期实对他表示了支持，但是现在呢，似乎是透露了这样的一个迹象，希望换一个，特别是在整个但是呢，我们说的突发消息是一条坏消息，就是现在西班牙的中右政党、西班牙的保守政党，现在是整个 EPP 里面除了德国保守党之外的第2大政党是说不对，我们呢要坚决的支持冯德莱恩。我们也知道，在整个欧盟的内部达成决议一个很重要的一个隐患就是什么呢？就是各个成员国必须都同意。那么所以现在现在西班牙对于这件事情表示不同意之后，那么德拉吉作为提名人的可能性也就暗淡了很多那么这里实际上也涉及到了马克龙比较复杂的一个角色。那我们知道马克龙一直呢是希望欧洲表现出某一种独立自主性，特别是与美国的政策中间呢不要事事跟着美国走，不要亦步亦趋。但是同时在一些重要的问题上，他又需要能够获得美国以及盟友的支持。现在马克龙也面临国内选民非常大的压力马克龙在国内的民调也非常的差同时呢，整个法国的整个的 就我们叫做商业啊，也有非常强烈的贸易保守主义，这一点呢也与德国有很大的不同。所以今天的稍后的六度解析栏目中啊，我们还会有一篇文章来分析法国和德国在面对中国的时候，为什么他们的商业和贸易企业产生了如此不同的两极变化。那么一言以概之，就是在德国拥有比较强大的政治游说势力的是什么呢？像比如说德国的汽车企业和制造企业，他们往往希望呢作为中国的这样的中国作为他们的重要的市场与中国保持比较良好的关系。法国当然也有企业视中国为重要的市场，比如说奢侈品牌等等等等，但是这一些呢往往具有比较大的我们叫做国际性，而不是在法国本土的政治上有很大的影响力啊。那么法国本土政治有比较大影响力的是什么呢？往往是法国的农业等等等等。所以这呢也是整个欧洲政治和欧洲经贸格局中非常微妙的一点。今天稍后六度解析继续为大家带来更多的介绍。好，再来说到的是跟金融经济有关的话题。最近呢，大家发现在中国简报我们又多了一位新的专栏作家这个罗建豪先生。近期给我们在中国简报中分享了非常有趣的一个观察，就是针对于金融领域的一系列的反腐措施，实际上似乎是习近平政府有意安排的多年大计。从最开始的高层人事设计，到高层的金融反腐，再到现在深入监管层，对于整个中国金融系统的基层和中层官员，仿佛呢都开展了一轮大清洗。在政经观察这一篇文章发表之后很多的观众朋友们也提出了非常大的兴趣。现在有关于金融反腐是时时提在路上，很多的这个金融从业者也发现，昔日的这样的一个非常辉煌的一个镀金行业，现在似乎有了暗淡的样子那么何明先生怎样看待近期对于金融领域的一系列的整顿？金融系统是不是要面临一轮大清洗
这个在几个月以前，我们跟观众也交代就是我跟中国的这个券商的高管呢有过一次聊天或者是在华尔街工作的有过聊天，他们共同的就是一个结论，就是呢，中国的股市没戏中国的股市完全没有戏，讲出了这些内幕和这个不想说内幕吧，内幕的细节已经不重要，结论就是呢这样一个实际上已经完全被绑架成为一些利益集团的一个取经的一个地方，而不是真正一个融资一个呢这个投资一个中国的经营体系。那么当时呢我就做出了极力的反对。我之所以反对的理由是，我说我正是因为你们讲的这些问题才是今天股市的一个结果，但是并不等于这个结果是中国的一个绝对的一个宿命，中国的股市就从此以后是这样了。恰恰相反现在存在的这些问题必须要一个一个清除，才有可能迎接中国真正的股市的这个正常化那么李奇博士是经济学博士，经常跟我们上基础性的这种经营发展的这个史，中国的经营发展史，这跟整个的改革开放其实是很不配套的，但是因为那个时候一个房地产一个想象或者是一个小摊贩都能够集合起大家的这种财富的热情，已经来不及想到的这个经营体系经过非常短暂的这种草试热情之后，韭菜被割了一批以后，橙子以后就是软趴趴了。但是20大的时候确定了这个经营管理体系，那就开始注意到实际上这个整个的一个新的一轮改革开放会把这个经营体系作为它非常重要的一个支柱，这已经确定下来了。但是做事情呢，我们在这里讲，老王一拍，习近平这个做错了，习近平那个做对了。其实站在中国的这个体制里面就算是他在黑箱作业，他也需要花很多时间来完成这个黑箱的这个过程，才能让这个黑箱里面也能够运作。而刘建豪先生呢，他实际上用另外一个笔名，在这个20大之后就写过类似这样的文章他就认为呢，人事就是政治，当人事确定之后进行这个调整之后，才有可能真正进行这个变革，不像那么简单。你这个人是王岐山的，那个人是这个温家宝的，这个人又是什么朱镕基的，整个的官僚体系是由这么一些有背景的人组成，甚至他后面还有7大姑8大姨，这个7大姑搞得不好就是政治局常委，8大姑搞得不好就是政治局委员，在这样一个体系中间要进行一场变革，这些官僚们要对付你，其实是很容易的事情。所以呢，习近平就是要 要对人事进行这个打击啊调整，但是人事的打击整个的力度太轻了，太温柔了，相比这个越南来讲啊，这个早几年啊，这些法官们啊，这个也不知道收了谁的钱，还是被谁指使，把这些贪官们啊判个15年、10年，几年一条好汉又出来了，很多的贪官现在又是在中国的商场上混了，对吧？啊，那么这个，所以他这个人事的调整，对于这个经营体系的变革的这个意义啊，在刘建豪先生啊这篇文章里面表现出来。今天早上一个媒体的朋友马上来问啊，能不能采访刘建豪先生呢？啊，他当然不是在美国，是一个啊这个我们的一个专栏作家啊，那么他应该是一系列文章的开始，就怎么去解开啊，就是20大之后的习近平的一些政策的调整，在他看起来，中国实际上啊一个经营变革的时代其实已经开始来临，但是来临的时候还有很多问题没有解决。最重要的是解决了高层的，现在是谁是在当主席，谁是当央行行长，都已经解决了。但是中下层很多人其实还是有原来的官僚的体系或者原来毒瘤的一部分，这个也慢慢清除。所以这样就弄的这篇文章出来之后啊，让北京那些在经营体系里面这些年滋润的很的这些官员啊，开始心惊肉跳。
好，谢谢这个何明先生的介绍啊。政经观察呢，也是我们新推出的这样的一个专栏啊，由罗建浩先生主笔，特别是有关于中国的经济政策以及金融政策与中国的政治之间的内在联系，在这个专栏中呢，大家会看到更多的分析。那么除此之外呢，在中国简报中啊，大家也听到来自李卫军的有关于中国地产的相关的评估和分析。那么在这个文章发表之后啊，很多观众朋友们也提出了很多不同的反馈。那么李卫军先生就判断说，中国楼市的底实际上呢已经非常之近了，之后呢很有可能会出现某一种复苏这样的一个态势啊。那么昨天我们也特别注意到这样的一个观点啊，也是得到了一些国际机构的呼应。大家特别关注到的就是高善文先生啊，国投证券的首席近期的一个演讲，那么也表达了类似的这样的一个观点。当然，高善文先生他不仅仅讲的是中国的楼市，也讲到了是现在这个中国的这个贸易盈余到底是怎么造成的，整个的这个中国地产市场调整是不是已经完成了，下一轮的出清什么时候开始啊，利率是不是出现长期下行等等等等。那么其中呢，一个比较值得我们关注的观点就是说，现在整个的这个地产价格，他认为已经是到了合理的区间，已经到了就是我们就说价格调整接近完成这样一个区间，但他同时也警惕啊，就是说我们这个价格见底呀，往往需要偏离合理，因为现在中国地产有这样一个情况，就是火烧连营，大家怎样达到一个心理的底呢？一定有时候我们叫做就要超过合理区间的，要刺穿底之后呢，才能回到某一个合理区间。这呢是高善文先生的这样一个观点。同时啊，在讲到日本的时候啊，高善文先生讲到当时在日本的时候有这样一句话，叫做不出海就出局。什么意思呢？就是当时的日本企业像现在的中国企业一样啊，也是面临着整个国内竞争环境和信贷环境的恶化，而出海企业呢，往往更有投资的吸引力。其实类似的观点，我们在思想先驱报中也为大家介绍到，叫做山海关、生死关。现在中国企业面临国内的情况啊，不管是这个资金状况，还是呢国内的竞争压力都不太好的时候，往往呢目光需要更加长远，与当年日本出海的经验是一样的。而高善文先生的完整的这样的一个演讲全文，以及我们对于他的演讲的概括整理和要点梳理，在六度解析栏目中大家已经可以看到了。好了，这呢就是
抱歉，我再讲一两句话啊，就是说昨天晚上一个投资者啊，一个投资家就跟我聊天，介绍了一些情况，这些情况大部分都是关于欧洲的这个地理情况，正好是呼应了这个李奇博士的讲话。那我顺便要讲一句话的意思是什么呢？我就顺便聊到我们的观众的问题，我就说，我们的观众希望有一些专家、一些学者、一些投资家成为我们的观众啊。那么这位这个投资家就是说，他说实际上我们的观众很多就是像他是这样的人，如果他不是这样的人，怎么会来愿意听这些听起来比较枯燥的一些报告、一些研究的文章？但是尤其是这个现在我们的六度解析、思想先驱报，还有这个我们的很多的华尔街智库的这些文章，看这些的文章的人，不要说在中国，即使是在美国，其实也是精英阶层看的。所以这句话听得我 心里面还有点安慰啊。同时也注意到了，就是李奇博士我们之前介绍的这个欧洲的这个电力啊，只是放在会员区还没有公开，就已经被我们的网友注意到了。而且是位投资家。
好，谢谢这个和平先生为我们思想先驱报会员俱乐部做广告啊！如果大家想看到为什么这个欧洲可能是 AI 下一个我们叫做淘金的要点啊。那么在思想先驱报的会员俱乐部呢，你已经可以参与我们的讨论了。怎样加入思想先驱报的会员俱乐部呢？只要加入华尔街电视的会员，这样就可以在第一时间看到我们每期录制的最新节目了。如果您希望加入我们的讨论，在六度世界加入思想先驱报会员俱乐部，就可以参与我们会员网友的共同讨论。好，感谢我们观众朋友们对于我们的支持，感谢云水，感谢如是我闻，感谢甜甜金山，谢谢大家对于我们节目的支持。下周华尔街论坛与您再会。
欢迎来到中经分析。中国拯救楼市系列举措，底离我们不远了。中经分析专栏作家李卫军。大约1周前，中国政府出台了一系列举措，力图拯救楼市。其中最引人注目的措施是央行出资3000亿人民币，用于直接购买市场上闲置的住房。事实上，此次救市政策出台之前，中国楼市出现的持续下跌，本质上是政府在过去几年打压房价，逼迫开发商降杠杆所引发的楼市慢挤兑。何为挤兑？以银行挤兑为例，若银行资产质量不好，储户预期银行资产的价值已经远远小于银行负债储户存款时，就会争先恐后去取款。道理很简单，因为银行以资不抵债，储户去晚了，就会面临取不出来钱的风险。具体到中国楼市，慢挤兑表现为投资者逐渐发现楼价已远高于其基本面决定的价值，并且难以继续上涨，因而逐渐卖出房子，从楼市中将钱取出，而引发的价格缓慢下跌。这样的情况出现，其实是很危险的，因为任何一个微小的坏消息或事件，会引发大量投资者恐慌性卖房，房价急跌，转变为挤兑，很难处理。举例来说，去年发生危机的瑞士信贷，在危机爆发前一段时间就已经出现了慢挤兑。挤兑的导火线是瑞信延期发布财报这一利空消息，引发了市场恐慌，慢挤兑变为挤兑，瑞士政府不得不出手干预。通常，一个有毒资产引发挤兑，影响到金融或经济稳定，其规模应以 GDP 的倍数来衡量。政府直接出资购买有毒资产，稳住价格，首先要面对的问题是耗资巨大。从这个意义上讲，中国的 GDP 大约为130万亿人民币，而此次救楼市，央行只拿出3000亿收购闲置住房，显然是不够的。一个更聪明和普遍的做法是政府做一个简单且模糊的承诺，稳定房价，出资购买过剩的商品房，而不言明具体金额。这样的承诺如果可信，投资者预期改变，挤兑也就止住了，最后政府可能就不必出资购买有毒资产了。我注意到，过去1周与央行出资收购闲置住房相配套的，还有一系列政策，包括降低首付和房贷利率，部分城市解除购房限制等等。这些新的政策组合，标志着过去几年紧缩楼市的政策转向，新一轮宽松开始。目前我们看到的政策，显然也只是干预楼市的初始，未来肯定还会加码。因而，我们也就无需纠结3000亿资金是否够用。这也意味着，短期之内，楼市的政策底已经出现。政府购买有毒资产的第二个常见问题是价格如何形成。举例来说，西红柿的标价是每公斤10人民币，但是卖不出去。那么政府来收购，价格应该定为多少？这其实是个很难回答的问题。这个问题意味着央行出资购买闲置住房的政策落实时会面临一些问题，需要一定时间。这一点，外加上文提到的初始计量不足的问题，意味着楼市短期内的市场底还没有到来。但是，它离我们已经不远了。中经分析专栏作家李卫军系中国简报特约分析专家。
China's economy is in a slowdown. To get a better picture of how the slowing economy is affecting people on the ground, Bloomberg talked to people across a range of incomes and industries.
People with their own companies, entrepreneurs, people working in the financial sector, but also people working as window cleaners, people supplementing their income as Didi drivers.
Rebecca Chung-Wilkins is Bloomberg's correspondent for the economy and government team in Hong Kong. None of the people Bloomberg spoke to wanted us to record their voices for fear of repercussions in China. But by and large, people did tell us that they aren't feeling as well off as they did 5 years ago. One of them is Mr. Huang, who asked us to use just his last name.
He is an entrepreneur of sorts. He's a commodity trader in his 40s. And a few years ago, he started his own company, running his own outfit, essentially.
In the pre-COVID years, Huang was pretty successful and had a cushy life.
He bought an apartment in this very trendy district of Shenzhen. He also bought himself and treated himself to a Tesla Model X.
But things have really changed for him in the last few years. Huang says business has never been tougher.
So his business is essentially predicated on buying energy from generators and selling this to small factories. And what he told us is that he finds that these factories aren't wanting to lock in power contracts that as long as they previously would. And it's essentially because they're just not sure that there is going to be continued strong demand for their products.
All that meant Huang has had to make some hard decisions about his own business.
Ultimately, he's ended up sacking 5 employees in his firm because he has this worsening outlook over the market for 2024. And he talks about having last year to become a sort of so-called 软饭男.
Okay, wait. So you have to explain what is 软饭男.
So 软饭男 is this expression that literally translates as something like a sort of soft rice man. But this idea of being a soft man and not being able to provide for your family. And it's really a joke about the fact that he had to rely on his wife's income to take care of his family last year.
What Huang is experiencing is a new reality for many Chinese citizens.
Mr. Huang also tells us that he's far from alone in this situation. He talks about how a lot of the private business owners that he knows are trapped in this debt cycle, so they're borrowing new loans to pay old ones. And even those who were, for example, considering having more kids have had to cancel those plans because they can't afford to grow their family right now.
Rebecca says the negative sentiments the downturn is stirring up could be a real problem for the ruling Communist Party. And that's because for decades, the party has held power through a kind of bargain with the Chinese people.
So one way to think about this bargain or this relationship is as a kind of social contract. Essentially, people accept fewer freedoms in exchange for a promise of a better life. So Chinese people don't necessarily have an active say in how they're being governed. They don't get to vote in elections. But what they do get for the last several decades is a rapid increase in their prosperity. Now, some political scientists debate whether you can really call this a social contract because ordinary Chinese people don't have a say in that exchange. But there is still this broader question, which is what happens when that promise of prosperity, when that bargain starts to falter. And now we see that it isn't necessarily breaking down entirely, but we are starting to see these signs that the bargain is beginning to fray.
Welcome to the Big Tech Asia from Bloomberg News. I'm Wan Ha. Every week, we take you inside some of the world's biggest and most powerful economies and the markets, tycoons, and businesses that drive this ever-shifting region. Today on the show, China's economic miracle is ending. So how does President Xi Jinping keep up the bargain that the Communist Party's had with its people for decades? So there are a number of reasons why people in China aren't feeling great about the economy right now. The most looming setback is the property sector.
So the bulk of household wealth in China is actually held in real estate. About 70% of family assets are tied up in property. And for more than a decade, there was too much property speculation, too much building, and too much debt. And the consequence ultimately of this whole housing boom was that China was left with a huge amount of overcapacity in the real estate sector. Bloomberg Economics estimates that at the start of the 2020s, China was building about 30% more property than it actually needed each year.
At the end of 2021, one of China's biggest developers, Evergrande, defaulted on its bonds. Basically, they were unable to pay their debt to investors. Their default was followed by more than 36 firms that also struggled to manage their debt loads. Rebecca says the collapse in the property market has people feeling pessimistic about making other kinds of investments.
So Chinese people have gone from thinking, I've got this asset which is hugely valuable and accruing more value each year, I'm rich, to now thinking, I've got this asset which I thought was really valuable, but maybe it isn't, and I just don't feel quite as rich as I did a few years ago.
Another reason why some Chinese people aren't feeling quite as rich is wage cuts. The Common Prosperity Agenda, one of Xi Jinping's signature policies, brought crackdowns on multiple industries: technology, property, education, and even gaming. And that, of course, led to massive job and wage cuts.
在推进全体人民共同富裕上，
It aimed to close the wealth gap and lift the country's poorest. Here's what Bloomberg's chief economist, Tom Orlik, has to say on the policy.
What's the motivation for the Common Prosperity Agenda? Well, I think it's partly that China had a big problem with inequality. The rich were getting really, really rich, but a bunch of people were being left behind. So Common Prosperity is partly about addressing that problem. It's also about how to deal with a slower growing economy. When the economy is growing 8, 9, 10%, everyone's getting richer, everyone's feeling happy, everyone's supportive of Communist Party rule. When the economy is just growing 4 or 5%, well, you need to pay a bit more attention to how that 4 or 5% is getting shared out to make sure everyone's getting a little bit of the pie.
Now, to be clear, the official data show average incomes are still rising. More slowly, but still rising. But other indicators suggest that things might be less positive.
We look at business surveys. They show factories and offices thinking more about shedding workers than adding workers. We look at a survey from the central bank, which suggests that households are getting more and more pessimistic about their future earnings. So we don't have like perfect clarity on what's happening in China's labor market or what's happening with China's wages, but the data we do have suggests at a minimum, wage growth is slowing and perhaps there are some more serious problems there.
All that leads to a shrinking of household spending. People aren't buying new houses or having kids.
So just like Mr. Huang mentioned when he talked to us, some of his friends no longer want to have children, or they're delaying plans to have children because they just don't feel like they can afford to. And this is a bigger problem, that people don't necessarily want to have babies if they're worried about being able to afford a bigger apartment to house another child, as well as account for all the extra costs, things like education, medical care. Essentially, it's this concern that they're worried about whether or not they have enough money and just how much it's going to cost to have a bigger family.
So, Rebecca, at the beginning of the show, we mentioned the bargain between China's ruling Communist Party and the Chinese people, right? You give us control, we make you prosperous. Now, China's current leadership is facing an ongoing real estate crisis. You've got slowing growth and income and a low fertility rate, among other things. On top of that, many Chinese may not be as hopeful about their futures right now. Is China's social contract being renegotiated here?
So the way we frame this question in our story is in terms of Ronald Reagan's famous question to US voters back in 1980, which is, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And of course, back in 1980, for many American voters, the resounding answer to that question was no, I'm worse off, which is why Jimmy Carter lost the election and Ronald Reagan entered the White House. Now, China doesn't have elections, but it does have politics. And one of the reasons why politics in China has been so stable is because the Chinese Communist Party, for much of the past 4 decades, have been able to deliver this really stellar increase in prosperity. So if you ask Chinese people, are you better off than you were 5 years ago, which is the length of China's presidential term, at almost any point over the past 40 years, the answer would most likely have been, yes, I'm much better off than I was. But under Xi Jinping, the answer is quite a bit more complicated. So while average households are still seeing their incomes rising, they are rising at a much slower pace than they were. And anyone who put their nest egg in, say, Chinese real estate or equities will have taken a pretty significant hit. So Chinese households aren't necessarily feeling richer than they did. And in fact, many of them might be feeling poorer.
There was one moment where that prosperity evaporated at the end of the 1980s, where inflation and unemployment shot up. That was when we saw a genuine challenge to the authority of the Communist Party. That culminated in the bloody crackdown at Tiananmen Square. So, Rebecca, where are we now?
Well, we're certainly not in anything like as dire a situation as the end of the 1980s. Back then, we saw real incomes were actually falling, for example. But even so, we are seeing this shift from a long period of rapid rises in prosperity to a much more complicated situation where incomes are growing more slowly, wealth is falling. And all of that does mean there is a change in the social contract or a change in the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people.
After the break, how President Xi Jinping is managing the fraying of the social contract. The sound you're hearing is from the White Paper movement in 2022. That's when protesters held up blank sheets of paper to oppose COVID controls in Shanghai. And it eventually brought a rapid end to the lockdown that lasted 2 months. Since then, there's been striking developments in demonstrations in China over the past year.
Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor, for example, calculated that about 80% of all the protests that they documented for 2023 were related to the economy. We're seeing an increasing number of protests related to the economic strains that people are feeling these days, including failed real estate projects. But that isn't bubbling up into widespread protests that present any kind of existential challenge to the party. Well, it's really rare to see coordinated, widespread protest in China because of the sort of tightly controlled nature of society, which is heavily surveilled. So typically protests in China is quite small scale, it's quite sporadic, spontaneous in nature, and it very rarely targets the central government or President Xi Jinping himself directly with criticism. If we do see criticism of authorities, it's more often directed, for example, to local governments or local authorities who they may feel have not sufficiently protected them against certain risks.
But Tom says it's important to keep the recent slowdown in context. The average Chinese household is still much better off than they were, say, 40 years ago. And that buys the party a certain amount of goodwill from the people. Plus, things are bad, but they aren't that bad.
We don't have mass unemployment. We don't have average incomes falling. We don't have a financial crisis. So we're talking about a slowdown for many, a stagnation for some, but we're not talking about an economic crisis.
Meanwhile, the Politburo, China's highest policy-making body, is signaling that it will take action to help support the economy.
So in economics, as in fairy tales, the magic number is very often 3. And I see 3 planks to the Chinese Communist Party's strategy to deal with this new problem of slower income growth and falling wealth. The first strategy is to stimulate. We're not seeing the big bazooka stimulus that we've seen in past Chinese downturns, but Beijing has definitely got out a bunch of water pistols and it's trying to douse the flames in the property sector and ensure that incomes and wealth don't fall too far. The second part of the strategy is something that political scientists call preventative repression. That's the technological panopticon which gives China's 1.4 billion citizens the strong sense that whether they're online or walking on the street, somebody's watching them. And the third part of the strategy is what Xi Jinping calls common prosperity. It's the idea that the pie is going to grow more slowly, but it's going to be shared out in a more equitable way. It's kind of a grab bag of different policies, fines for the tech monopolies, instructions to the gig economy companies to pay their workers at least a living wage. The crackdown on the real estate sector, which is causing enormous pain for China's economy writ large, but is also bringing down house prices and making them more affordable to first-time buyers.
And Rebecca says it's important to remember that the Chinese economy has multiple engines for growth. It's not just about real estate. She says the government is eyeing new growth drivers.
One way to think about the Chinese economy is like an aeroplane, so that has 2 or 4 engines, so different engines and different things that are driving it. Now, property is one of those engines, but there are other things too. There are things like exports that rely on global demand. And what we're kind of currently underway is a plan by Xi Jinping and by Beijing to change what engines are driving that plane and what is essentially keeping that plane up in the air. And as that happens, naturally, of course, you get quite a bit of disruption. And if you're on the plane, you look at that property engine and it looks like it's on fire. Of course, people start to panic. You start to really worry.
Yeah, and of course, it's not going to be helpful to tell people not to panic.
Absolutely. It doesn't help to see one of those engines caught on fire. And it's very hard then to try and restore confidence. Ultimately, the goal is to get consumers back on the streets and spending. It's hard to do that. If you see property in the state that it is, it's hard to be convinced that you should go out and invest in a business. But that's not to say that, of course, the economy is anywhere close to the precipice of collapse, because you definitely still have these other engines of growth. And in the meantime, Beijing is, of course, trying to institute these other mechanisms. So look at, for example, the 3 new drivers, things like solar panels, EVs, batteries, where the hope is that they will start to make up some of the losses that you're seeing in other parts of the economy.
And to better understand Reagan's question, are you better off in the China context, Bloomberg looked at 2 data sets, one on economic growth and another on political freedom. Bloomberg's analysis suggests China has come full circle in those 2 respects.
So we looked at IMF data on China's GDP growth, and we looked at a political science data set on freedom in China. That includes things like freedom of the press, freedom for academics, and freedom to express your opinion in public, for example. And these 2 data sets, when you bring them together and look at how growth and freedom have evolved in China over the last 40 years, they tell a really striking story. So back at the start of the reform era, or even before the reform era began, we see that growth was really weak and freedom was really constrained. And then if we go through and look later during China's leadership under Deng Xiaoping, freedoms expanded and growth accelerated. Under Jiang Zemin, freedoms remained in place and growth remained strong. And then finally, under Hu Jintao, you saw the beginnings of a slowdown in growth, the beginnings of an erosion of social freedoms. Finally, under Xi Jinping, the erosion of growth and the narrowing of social freedoms has continued to the point where China has almost come full circle, with growth slower and freedoms more constrained. Though it is important to bear in mind that, of course, living standards under President Xi Jinping versus under Mao Zedong are much, much higher.
How did you grow up? You grew up in Hong Kong, and how did you get interested in whatever ended up, in your field right now?
All right. I grew up in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was a British colony at the time, and most people in Hong Kong were rather relatively poor. At the time, it was like a developing, I mean, it's not a country, it's a colony. It's a developing society, and most people were not very well educated at the time. In my parents' generation, they all got clobbered by the war and the World War II, and the education were interrupted, and many of them don't formally go to school, and both of my parents did not finish high school, and but they were just like many Asian parents. They are very adamant that all the children should be well educated, and that's what they put the emphasis on. So I went through a very grassroots type family. We live in very cramped apartments, and when I was at a very young age, we kind of won the lottery from the government, because at the time the government was building plenty of government housing, high-rise apartments that have that they rent out to the population at very low prices, low rent, and so we sort of won the lottery and moved into one of those, and that really changed our trajectory. And we stayed there. I grew up there in the housing project, and later on, as our family got a little bit more resources, we moved out to private housing. But the early years, we grew up in a housing project, which really immersed us into the general public of the society, which gave me a pretty good perspective of what the society is about.
Who would have put more premium on education amongst your parents? Was it your dad or your mom?
Both of them, because they didn't have a chance to go through formal education, and so they realized, and right after the war, everybody needs to make a living, so to speak, and so there wasn't much of an opportunity for them to get a formal education. So they are very insisting that everybody should in the family should be well educated.
How did you discover electrical engineering? I mean, you could have done other things, right?
Yeah, I could have done other things. That was, I guess, the society at the time gravitated towards STEM type education, because that seems to be a kind of like a ticket to a better life, better career. And the humanities and the arts are less well defined. For example, if you're licensed to become an engineer, then of course you're licensed to practice, you got a good career and so on. Whereas the other professions seems to be more nebulous and less well defined. And so a lot of the kids at the time who did well in school tend to pick one of the STEM fields to go into, and so no exception for me, follow the crowd and enter kind of go into a science type curriculum. And out of the science type of curriculum, the physics and the chemistry part of the science curriculum is more kind of quantitative and formal, and makes it easier to quantify, and at least for me, it's easier to understand. And rather than, for example, in biology, for example, it's more to me at the time, it looks like a more observational science. You need to remember a lot of things.
Right.
And I'm not very good at remembering things. So
you're being modest.
So the physics and the chemistry looks better. Now, when I was about to enter college or university at the time, the careers for people who study basic science is rather limited, because there's not a basic science research as in the US it is today, right? But being a basic science researcher is not a career in Hong Kong at the time, right? So most of the science type careers are more practical. Engineering is one of them. So many of our contemporaries becomes engineers. And out of all the engineering, electrical engineering is closest to physics. And it used many of the same concepts in physics, quantum mechanics and electromagnetics and so on. They're more closer to physics, so that's why I got attracted to it.
Yeah, I think it's probably safe to assume that countries or nations or governments or political cultures within each that would have put strong emphasis on STEM, they tend to have done well, as opposed to those that probably put less emphasis on STEM, right? Would you attribute this to the political culture in your household, or sort of like the pervasive political culture at any dimension, at any level? Or you think this would have been something that would have been driven by the leadership of that country, that nation, or the government?
I think if you talk about, if you look at many of the Asian countries, they have this strong emphasis on STEM.
Yeah.
And my crude understanding is that from an economic development point of view, you do need these skills from an economic development point of view. If you want to build infrastructure, you need engineers to build the bridges and roads and so on and so forth. If you want to have industry, you need people who can do the engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and so on and so forth. That's, I think, mostly coming from the point of view of economic development. But I should say that economic development in and of itself only takes you so far. At some point, the society will need things other than economic development. Yeah. And that's where the humanities and the arts and so on comes in, that people in society are not just simply satisfied with the money.
Right.
But beyond, there's a lot more than making a living. Once you are comfortable about making a living, then you look for something else. I think that is the part that a lot of the Asian countries may not have recognized.
I'm just, sensing that there's still quite a lot of countries that have not focused on STEM as much as some countries that we might have seen.
Why so?
Not sure. I mean, I'm in the camp that believes that I think a higher degree of focus on STEM is correlated with your ability to move marginal productivity, because that's correlated with innovation and all that good stuff, right? And being able to combine that with liberal arts or humanities, I think that makes it even more a good combination. But some countries, I think, tend to focus a lot less on STEM. And that I think has hampered development to some extent. And I'm just happy with how Hong Kong, has put a lot of emphasis on STEM, along with some other Asian countries, such as Korea, China, Japan, and now recently, you've talked about Vietnam and Southeast Asia, right? You can see that in the tenacity with which the people of Vietnam, I think, are focusing on STEM. I come from a region, called Southeast Asia, where I think the focus on STEM needs to be, more emphasized going forward. You went to Hong Kong University.
Yeah.
Then you decided to move to the US.
Yes.
Why?
Well, very simple. I am interested in kind of more advanced knowledge beyond the bachelor's degrees type education. I was looking for a place where I could get a PhD. At the time, it was in early 80s. None of the universities in Hong Kong are what you would call a research university. They're basically teaching universities. Just in the colonial days, the universities in Hong Kong are meant to train bureaucrats for the civil servants in service of the government, and they're not interested in doing research. So there's really no opportunity to do any research in Hong Kong. Yeah. So I came to the US.
And it's worked out okay with you?
So far, I'm okay, I guess.
Now I want to shift gear to your area of focus. I mean, I know you're teaching electrical engineering, and you're one of the few people that understand the semiconductor, sector. Why is it called semi, not full conductor?
That's interesting. But before I get to that, let me just finish by your previous question. I think my kind of journey from Hong Kong to the U.S. is a very typical journey for many immigrants who are in the technology field.
Right.
They got educated in their home country and came to the U.S., saw an opportunity to get better education, and then many of them do stay. And I think it's a very important source of talent for the U.S. And maybe we could come back to that later. But I think it's really important. If you look around in academia, in industry, many of them do come through this route of getting an advanced degree and ended up staying.
It's been the main source of innovation in the U.S.
Absolutely. If you look at top management CEOs of big companies, many of them come through this route. And that's very important.
Well, while on this, I mean, do you see that as something that's likely to continue, given?
I think that's in jeopardy.
Okay.
Given the recent,
the political calculus seems to be.
Seems to be the pendulum has swung to the other side in recent years, and you see a lot of soul searching about immigrants or foreign students and openness in research and things like that. And that, I think, that creates an environment in which, for a potential student from other countries looking at the U.S., and they would begin to think about whether this is the right place for them, or rather they would go to some other countries to get their education and the experience. When I was just graduating from college, that answer is very obvious. Where do you go? The U.S., of course. But now
you've got optionalities.
Now we got options, and also not only options from a pull point of view, but from a push point of view.
Correct.
A lot of people felt that the U.S. may not be so welcoming as before, and so I think that route or that flow of people is somewhat in jeopardy.
On the other question, why is it called semi?
Oh, why is it called semiconductor? I forgot who I heard it from when somebody talked about semiconductors, and somebody who's not in the field asked, why semiconductor? How come a full conductor is not better? Cup half full? Well, what is a semiconductor? A semiconductor is a material that, as its name implies, not very conducting, not very insulating, and somewhere in between. And why do I want something in between? It's because a full conductor would be something like a piece of metal, like copper or silver or that kind of thing, right? So a full conductor. Now, not a full, but a real conductor, basically. Why semiconductor? Semiconductor is used to build switches, like electrical switches, wall switches, flip on the switch and turn on the lights. And computers are actually a bunch of switches. We compute by designing the organization, arranging switches, how to route the switches around. In the early days, the telephone, you have a switchboard, and you have real people who connect one line with another that in a switchboard. And all these are replaced by chips today, of course. And so computers do computation by flipping switches, basically. So a semiconductor can be turned on to be conducting, or be turned off to be not conducting. And that basically is what a switch is about. So a semiconductor is used to build switches. And so that's why semiconductors are useful, because it can be turned on or turned off.
Gordon Moore, he came up with this prognosis decades ago that, things were going to behave in a certain way by way of the capacity growth, the speed growth, It's been very, very accurate.
Yes.
Right? Every year and a half to two, the doubling of the capacity and the speed. What's going to happen with Moore's Law?
Okay, first of all, that Moore's Law, which we refer to doubling of something, initially he was just suggesting doubling the number of transistors on a chip. And later on, people modified it and double anything, which is not really what he meant, but people tend to associate it with Moore's Law that way.
Right.
But that one is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's actually a rather unusual situation for a technology or for industry. I believe one of my colleagues, Professor Jim Plummer, said that he's not aware of any other industry that has this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, namely that everybody thinks that in X number of years, such things will happen.
Right.
And so because companies are competing, because there's a prediction out there, companies are trying to either meet or exceed that prediction so that you can be better than your competitor. So as a result of that competition to get to that particular goal, that goal is satisfied because of the intense competition. And also, not only just the desire to compete, but also having a goal allows everybody up and down the chain, the entire chain of events, from materials to device technology to circuit design and architecture and so on and so forth, up and down the chain to have a predictable cadence. Let's say I'm designing something. I need what I designed to be run on some kind of chip. Now, I cannot start designing the chip unless I know what the chip technology can do, what the capability is. Just like if you try to run a marathon, right. I cannot win the marathon unless I know what my capability is. So you need to know what the capability is before you can design your chip. Now, without that prediction, you wouldn't be able to say, I'm going to design this based on this assumption that the chip technology will give me this kind of performance. I cannot do that. But with this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, I know in 2 years, the chip technology will advance to a point where I can count on that particular performance. And so therefore, I will tailor my design based on that assumption. And that's very powerful.
Very powerful. It sort of framed the behavior of the industries.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Consistently for decades. Even that I gave the example of designing chips, even down to the material supplier. The material supplier knows that the chip manufacturer will need this kind of material or will need this kind of material to have that kind of performance in 2 years. So therefore, I work on developing it with the full knowledge that when I get done, I will have a customer. That risk mitigation is very important. If I develop something, I spent millions, multi-million dollars developing something. I didn't know whether there's a customer. That's bad.
Yeah.
But in this case, I know.
At the risk of quoting you in previous conversations, at the rate that the percentage of how the chips occupy our lives, if not lifestyles, at an increasing rate, whether it's opening your window in the car, turning on your toaster, turning on your microwave oven, whatever, before you get to the more complex stuff. What's going to happen to Moore's Law? Is it likely to be more exponential than whatever we have seen in the last few decades?
I think there are two dimensions of it. Well, for short answer, yes, it's going to be more exponential.
Yeah.
Okay. Why do I say that? First, for the last several decades, we know that there's one way to improve the performance of the chips, which is to make it smaller. And there are a lot of physics involved and to explain why making it smaller is better, right? So we know that there's one way, and we've been kind of turning that knob for several decades now.
Right.
And that knob has kind of saturated a little bit, just like anything else. You put the gas pedal, it hits the floor. Right? In the beginning, you're accelerating, but then pretty soon you hit the floor, right? So that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that progress will not continue to be made, because there are many other knobs. There are many other ways to make progress. It's just the analogy I'd like to have is, for the past 50 years, we've been walking inside a tunnel. There's only one way ahead. We know what the goal is, and we just want to make progress. And to make progress, that's one, making devices, making transistors and memory smaller will allow us to pack more devices on the same chip and therefore get more functionality, better performance, and so on. That method is the one method that we know, and that is saturating, but it's more or less like walking inside a tunnel. There's no way to go, it's the only way forward. But now we're at the exit of the tunnel. Now at the exit of the tunnel, there are two ways to interpret it. One, you fall off the cliff, you're just dead. Second is the world is open, wide open, no more confining. You cannot go left or right. You can go anywhere you want. And I think my interpretation is we're at the exit of a tunnel. There's so many possibilities, and we will continue to grow in capability in an exponential way, or even faster. Now, why am I so optimistic about that? Is because necessity is the mother of inventions, and that my optimism arises from the fact that society demand more from these chips, not less. The society will demand more and more from semiconductor technologies, chip technology, in the coming decades than we have done in the past few decades. So because it's coming from the demands, innovation will come up and bring the technology up in a much faster pace than before, because we are not confined by the tunnel anymore.
What could go wrong?
What could go wrong? Geopolitics could go wrong. Okay. I think that's a very important aspect that wasn't there just maybe like a handful of years ago. I think that is an important part, because research and development thrive on collaboration. And there are many, many examples. We can go into that a little bit more later. But it thrives on collaboration. And if geopolitics cause collaboration to not happen, then the rate of progress will be severely curtailed. I think is something that could go wrong.
You know, we're going through this era of what I call multipolarity, right? And I've said it before that, ironically, in a multipolar world, multilateralization becomes more difficult, because there's this tendency of revisionism by the new middle powers or greater than middle powers, right? And the pre-existing superpowers are not comfortable in embracing this new mode of multipolarity. I want to put this in the context of what you've been affiliated with, TSMC, right? They've basically created a recipe for success that involved a lot of collaborative undertakings, right? From a supply chain standpoint, from a research and development standpoint, from what have you, not just amongst enterprises, but also between academia and policymaking and entrepreneurship, right? What made them the way they were or they are?
I think your observation is extremely astute in the sense that a lot of people think a company like TSMC is a collection of factories and tools,
right,
or even just factory workers, and that's about it. But really, it is not. It is a enterprise that involves a lot of collaborations, that thrive on the network of customers, network of suppliers, network of collaborators in research and development, network of collaboration with the broader society in which they live in,
right,
the Taiwan society. It is a network of all these things, and even more, perhaps, I didn't go into. So that piece, that collection of relationship is what makes this company the way it is. Let's say we all of a sudden transplant this company to another country or another place that doesn't have the same political economic system. It is highly questionable whether they can continue to operate the way it is.
Yeah. So how do other countries try to replicate just any bit of what TSMC might have been able to do? And I'm not singling TSMC out here. There have been others that have been legendary and great, right?
Yeah.
The Samsungs of the world, the Intels of the world.
Absolutely.
But I think TSMC has proven itself to be very resilient and very different. And their success seems to be sustainable so far.
So far, yes.
Right? And go back to the history of how it came about. Go back to that conversation between Morris Chang, the legendary Morris Chang, with, somebody or some people in Taiwan that made it the way it has become.
I think there are two, if not more, at least two very important elements. One, technology competition is really a talent competition. First, talent.
Yeah.
Second, the broader society's support of the industry, not just the company, but the industry itself. You need a infrastructure for the company to exist, and suppliers, customers, and so on. So let's talk about talent first.
Right.
Taiwan in the early days of the 60s, 70s through the 80s and 90s have sent, well, it's not that the government sent them, but students from that era, all after they graduate from college, they all went out to the US, to Europe, outside of Taiwan, who has more advanced education achievements in the universities to get education. And many of them stayed in the local host countries to gain work experience. And in time, many of them go back to Taiwan to continue the career for a variety of reasons. Want to be closer to home. And I guess that's maybe perhaps one of the biggest draw, be closer to home, or perhaps a perceived better career opportunity in the home country. So like playing in the home field, right? So which people sometimes feel more advantageous, and knowing the culture and the people well. So talent, the flow of talent is one of the most important things. If you look at the leaders of the tech industry in Taiwan today, many of them were educated in the US through this route, getting educated in college, go to other countries, the US, Europe, and so on, and go back to Taiwan, have a work experience, go back to Taiwan, bring the work experience, bring the knowledge with them. And that is very important. That is, I would say, perhaps is the one of the major
criteria.
Ingredients for the success. And it's not just limited to Taiwan, Korea as well. We look at the many top management in Samsung and Hynix and so on. Many of them were educated in the US. So that's one part of it. But that's one piece. But the other piece, which is important, is support of the society. If you think about how the semiconductor industry was started in Taiwan, it was really supported by the government. It's industrial policy, basically. The Taiwan government decided that this is an industry they want to get into, and they supported with building industrial parks, with starting ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, which spun off TSMC and many other companies as well. So the government really had a really robust industrial policy. Now, of course, industrial policy may or may not succeed. If you bet on the wrong thing, that's bad, right? And that's really, of course, if you're in the U.S., you know that the U.S. feels that they don't need an industrial policy, right? And we don't go into that. But in this particular case, industrial policy worked out for them, and the government really supported it, building industrial parks, finding other pieces of the puzzle to fill in the infrastructure for the semiconductor industry, and also basically the technology industry. Back in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, Taiwan basically manufactured, but basically it's the world's manufacturer for PCs and
everything, even bicycles.
And bicycles, bicycles as well, And so the government really supported it with really strong industrial policy.
That's amazing. Now, in early days, a lot of the intellectual property with respect to the microchip technology was done in the U.S. Do you think that with the benefit of hindsight, if the U.S. were to decide otherwise, meaning they would have wanted to onshore the manufacturing capabilities as opposed to offshore the manufacturing capabilities, would things have been different?
This is a very complex problem that I've been thinking about more recently, and I haven't come to any reasonable resolution or answer yet. And I can tell you what the kind of disconnect or problems are. One is, in the US, this, as I said, this is a technology competition, it's a talent competition. If you look at the cost of talents in Asian countries and in the US, the cost differential is pretty high. Right. So it's
getting smaller, but back then it was huge.
Oh, it was huge. It was huge, right? So to get talented people working on hard engineering problems in, let's say, in Taiwan or in Singapore or in Korea, is way less costly than it is in the US. So in other words, they could deploy many high-skilled talents to solve engineering problems, whereas the US is at a disadvantage in terms of cost. Not capital cost, but just talent cost, right? Give an example. I recently went through more than 20 years of TSMC annual report. Every year they report on the education level of the employees. Starting from 1999, about 40% of the employees have a bachelor's degree and above. Today, 80%.
Wow.
Now, that coincides precisely with the steady climb in the technology ladder, the leadership race, the steady climb from beginning. They were licensing it from RCA, licensing technology from the US and bring it back to Taiwan. Gradually, they learn how to do things themselves. And the way to do that is to get talented people. So they started from 40% people, employees who has a bachelor's degree and above, to today, 80%. And so that really tells you technology competition is a talent competition.
Yeah. Okay, in this context, which other countries do you think have done as much or just about the same amount that Taiwan has done? I mean, when you think about talent, you think about human capital, you think about countries that have shown, right, abilities to project intellectual capital, right? Within Asia or within the world, which countries do you think are likely to be able to emulate the kinds of successes that we've seen in Taiwan?
Well, I've seen countries like Singapore, Korea have been tremendously successful.
Yeah.
Like Korea, I remember back in the 60s and 70s, Korea was nowhere to be found,
nowhere,
right?
Yeah.
And then later on, they have kind of Me Too type products.
Right.
And we associate those
kind
of
products. You usually start out with Me Too's.
Yeah,
then you start being innovative and unique.
Exactly. Right. And then slowly they climb up the learning curve. And I remember years ago when you see Samsung, I said, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
You know,
well, now it's
not reliable. Now it's the best thing in the world. Right? So these countries have done quite well.
What about China?
China is, I don't think we could ignore their capability. They have, let me talk about something that I'm familiar with, just research.
Right.
I'm academia, I know research. Years ago, we have technical conferences and we see papers from China and say, forget it. Just quality is so bad. It's not even competitive.
No, it's very different.
Now, that was probably in the 80s and the 90s. Now, they're better than us. They're better than us. If you look at, I've looked at papers, publications, data from key conferences in the chips business. For example, in the International Electronic Devices Meeting, which is a device technology conference, the biggest one in our field. International Solid-State Circuits Conference, the Circuits and System Conference in our field, the two biggest conferences in our field. You basically flipped. Years ago, the U.S. had the majority of the papers. I remember there were roughly about 40 to 50% of the papers from the U.S. And China, maybe 20, 30 years ago, there were nowhere to be found. Today, China and Asia, the papers are more than 40%, almost close to 50%.
Oh my gosh.
And the US has steadily declined from 40, 50% to 30 to 40%. And the rest of the world, principally Europe and Japan, has basically fallen off the cliff. So the research and development, the research capability in Asian countries, China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and so on, have really become the strongest region in terms of producing good quality research. I'm not just talking about quantity, just quality. And the only thing that I see that the US is still a little bit ahead is in coming up with the new ideas. What the Chinese always say, going from 0 to 1. Namely, starting from nowhere, nothing, and come up with this really new idea. And if I look at what I would call new idea that is not been discussed before, the US still, if you read the research papers, the US still is the principal place where these new ideas come from. But once these new ideas become known, then
you see mushrooming of this new ideas in other places.
Exactly. And I feel it in my everyday research with my students.
Oh my gosh.
Any new ideas that we come up with, once they become known, this is a good idea.
And next week it will show up in China.
It will show up in China. Not only that, they do it better than you.
Yeah.
I cannot compete anymore. They have better resources. They have more students. They have more funding from the government. I cannot compete anymore. I have to get out of that field.
I want to get back to this, but I want to ask you about two countries like India and Israel. I mean, they have tremendous human capital, right? Do you see them as contenders in being able to, replicate the kinds of successes?
India
that
has
we've seen in
tremendous
Taiwan?
potential. It's tremendous potential. Their human capital is unbelievable. Not only they are a very populous country, of course.
Right. They got scale.
They got scale, right? And the statistics work out for them, right? When you have scale, then there are going to be outliers who are really smart and very innovative and so on, just like China, right? So that they have, that's very important. I think they have tremendous potential if they do things right, because they got scale, the people are smart, right? And in terms of Israel, they don't have scale. They're a small country, but they are smart people, obviously. The difficulty they have is lack of scale.
A bit like Singapore, then.
Yeah, a bit like Singapore.
Okay.
Right. In Singapore,
a lot of smart people.
5 million people.
Yeah, 5.5.
Yeah.
That's finite.
Yeah, finite. Yeah. They don't have scale.
Going back to China, with the advent of AI, how do you think the speed of new ideas creation is going to be impacted?
I think the speed of new ideas.
You can get AI to create a paper, right? Pretty much.
Yeah, but I think ideas still come from people. It's the acceleration from an idea to something useful that AI will be able to help with. The ideas still come from people, but today there are a lot of barriers and times and efforts required to bring some idea to fruition. Perhaps the advent of AI would shorten that life cycle, but the ideas still come from people, I believe. Now, AI would really help with the US and more advanced countries to get back into the game of manufacturing. Let me explain why. I mentioned earlier that the cost of human capital you cannot ignore it. The differential is there because of the standards of living and so on and so forth. It's there. Now, with AI and robotics, we should be able to make a lot of progress in advanced manufacturing, because in advanced manufacturing, you need many high-skilled people, because those manufacturings are so complex. It's not like repeatedly doing things over and over again according to a recipe. You need to be able to understand the process, improve on it, and those require high-skilled people, highly educated people. Now, the developed world have a very high cost for human capital. That being the case, you want to make really good use of those people. Those productivity has to be much higher. And the advent of AI, robotics would allow developed countries to deploy these highly skilled people much more effectively than before. And so using that would allow us to level the playing field a little bit about the cost of high skilled labor.
In the next 10 to 20 years, how do you see the landscape of the competition? In terms of countries. I mean, I think China is definitely pouring a lot more money onto this. The United States seems to be wanting to put more money onto this, not just on the IP side, but also on the manufacturing side. Mm-hmm. Korea seems to be very tenacious, right? How do you see the landscape?
It's
a bit like a Sputnik moment.
Yes.
From a chip standpoint.
And not only chip, but many technology as well.
Right.
Many other technologies you can think about, like, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. They're all like that, right? So the world is becoming a little bit, the world of manufacturing or technology becomes a little bit more polarized, right? So you kind of separate into 2 camps or 2.5 camps and things like that. Right. And people need to, some countries will need to play both sides and find their way around. But generally speaking, we think of it as 2 camps, right? Now, that being the case, then, as I mentioned earlier, for technology to advance, you really need open science. You need collaboration. So now, being that there are 2 camps, they don't talk to each other, that means things are going to go slower. What does that mean? That means the society is going to benefit less because things are going to go slower. All right. Second is the separation of supply chain, costs will go up. Right? You need to find your suppliers, not the lowest bidders, but thinking about geopolitical situation, so cost is going to go up. Now, the question is, who's going to absorb those costs? And it's not clear who's going to absorb those costs. And today, if you look at, in part, why manufacturing in the US is such a bad situation today is, in part, I believe, I'm no economist, I'm just guessing. I'm an engineer, right? So and maybe an economist listening to this podcast would say, wait a minute, what's this guy talking about, right? But my guess is that the distribution of profits is not equitable across the entire chain. The companies who are operating at the top of the food chain, they glean most of the profits. I'll give you an example. I was just at Western Digital the other day, and they told me that if you want to buy iPhone with more storage, they charge you $100 or $300 more. But the people who make the chips to make it happen get a few dollars. So
you were talking about level playing field,
right?
There's not a lot of equity there.
There's a lot of equity there, right? So this situation needs to be corrected. Otherwise, the manufacturing in the U.S. is not going to go well. I remember, for example, we talk about talent, right? I was once in a panel discussion with a bunch of semiconductor companies, and one person from company lamented that, we couldn't hire people. There's nobody wants to join my company. We have positions we need to fill and so on and so forth. Lack of talent, lack of workforce. So I asked him, how much do you pay them? And he went silent. He couldn't answer my question.
Wow.
Why? Because they couldn't pay them to compete with the other people who reaps the profit, right? And because they couldn't pay them, they couldn't get enough profits, so that's why they couldn't pay them, and so they couldn't hire the people.
So this scarcity of talent is really structural.
It is structural.
Right?
It's not so much. A lot of people thought that, we just need to tell the universities to offer more courses. No.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen. You need to have the demand. I could offer 10 courses, but if nobody takes my course, it wouldn't help you at all, right? You need to have the demand from the students. And where do you get the demand from the students? The students need to know that they have a bright career in front of them if they take these courses. If they go into this field, they will have a good career. Today is not the case for many of these manufacturing-related jobs.
So you're suggesting, if I get you correctly, there's likely to be a deceleration of the competition by way of the polarization.
If we haven't managed it right.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll manage it better, right? And also the scarcity of talent.
A scarcity of talent.
I think it applies on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. Right? The scarcity of talent.
It's not just on this side of the Pacific. I think it's on the other side of the Pacific too.
Exactly.
Given the scale, of course.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And that has to do with how the profits are fairly shared.
Right.
Because the companies who are doing the manufacturing and all the things below in the supply chain are not getting enough profits to offer good compensation, to offer good working environments to the employees.
So even within the supply chain, there's some players that are actually making disproportionately more than the other.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
That's a structural impediment.
Yeah, it is.
To the desired speed with which you want to move.
It is. I think the policy makers and the economists has to recognize that. Otherwise, it is structural.
The aspiration to onshore in the U.S., there's been some conversations, discussions, and initiatives for TSMC to build a plant here and there in the U.S., including in Arizona. Do you see that moving smoothly or as smoothly as aspired? Or
Well, I was at this big conference in December. I told you earlier, a few speakers conference. I saw all my colleagues from around the world, from Europe and Japan and so on. My Japanese friends are all laughing at us. You guys are the slowest.
Okay, that's public knowledge, I guess. Wow. Now, talk about, there's the logic chips, there's the memory chips, and there's the special chips, right? We call it discrete or whatever. How will that fare going forward in terms of who's going to be more dominant than the others within each one of those three categories?
I think those three categories, they're all important. Okay. Yeah, it's not like one is more important than the other. It's more important. Like, for example, we're doing this podcast, right? You need computers to crunch the data and stream the thing out.
Oh, and to store it too, somewhere.
Yeah.
Up
and
in the
you need storage to store it, right?
Yeah.
And the microphones, the video cameras, they all made of chips. Those are specialty chips, right? So they're all important. Right? And so we couldn't say, oh, we can do without one of them. No, we cannot. They're all important. Now, as far as resources goes, as of today, the development of logic chips requires the most of the resources, because they are the ones who are driving, in our kind of industry's parlance, is the technology driver. The requirements drive the development of new technology, new equipment, new processes, new materials, new devices, new design. Those applications drive with AI, it drives big computers that can crunch these numbers for the AI models. And it also drives the development of computing chips that are so energy efficient. You can do things on the edge, what they call the edge of the internet. You go buy a VR, AR headset today, you have to have a battery pack to come with it. And it's not the end state of VR, AR headset. I'm pretty sure about that. Right? In the final analysis, VR, AR headset is not going to operate like that. Yeah. But this is kind of like the intermediate stage that you need to go through. Just like cell phones used to be like size of a brick. Yeah. Right? And
I remember those.
You remember those, right?
In the early 90s.
In the early 90s, right? And those can only make a call and cannot do anything else.
Right.
And I will tell you a story. When I was at IBM, I used to work on image sensors. And in the mid 90s, I had an idea. I filed an invention disclosure about putting a camera on a phone, on a cell phone.
This was in the 90s, right?
It was in the 90s. And the IBM lawyers said, who wants a camera with a phone? We're not filing this
Say no more.
So after like months, I finally convinced them to file it, and we do have a patent on that.
They had a great ability of prognosticating about the future.
Right. So all these things, all the progress that we desire the chips to have, we desire the chips to have these capability today is driven by computing means. But it doesn't mean that it will continue to be the case. It doesn't mean that. And also it doesn't mean that there's no real need for innovation in other places. For example, just take image sensor, for example. Tremendous innovation in image sensor. And they offer new capability in VR headsets. You need to have new innovations in image sensor and the way they receive the signal, convert it, and do processing right up front, not right at the sensor end and not back in the mainframe computer. So all these innovation needs to happen in order to kind of satisfy our society's demand for technology in general. If you look at, for example, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, I basically go through all of them and say, hey, at least 12, 13 of them require advances in computing technology and chips technology in general. So without those, all those development goals will be severely curtailed.
The backers of all these are consisting of the designers and the manufacturers, right?
Yes.
Now, the Qualcomms of the world, the NVIDIAs of the world, they seem to be content with just designing, right? How do you see the progression going forward, or the shifting going forward? Are you likely, or are we likely to see them moving in the direction of manufacturing, given the complications or potential complications that we might see in the context of this polarization?
Wonderful observation. 30-some years ago, when Morris Chang came up with this split between fabless, namely companies that only design and do not have any factory for building chips, and foundries focus on building chips and not designing anything, that demarcation, that split, caused a blossoming of design activities, because people who design do not need to own the capital and all the baggage of owning a factory. And so they could then specialize on doing design. At the same time, people who own the factory can specialize on running the factory, and also having the benefits of having zillions of customers instead of one customer. If I manufacture my chip, I sell my chips directly to the customer, then I not only one customer, that's myself. That's not enough to have scale, to have this economy of scale for the manufacturing. So this split has really blossomed in terms of making the design ideas go a lot faster than before, and created a lot of business opportunity that did not exist before. Because previously you have to have tremendous capital investment before you can design your own chip. Now you don't. You just have to design and somebody will make it. Now that split has gone on really well for the last 30-some years. But today, if you look at the fabless and the foundry, they're not really split. They're actually together. Companies like Apple, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, they show up at the foundries every day. They tell the foundry, hey, run this wafer, try this experiment, show me the results, give me the wafers so I can test it myself. So they are actually doing a lot of the development work of the chip itself. So the leading edge technology basically are today co-developed between the foundry and the leading user. Whoever placed the largest order have a big say in how the technology is going to be designed and optimized.
But what about skin on a game, though, in terms of manufacturing capabilities? Are they likely to put more skin on it?
It seems to be the case. There are indicators in there already. For example, Sony put in money in Japan and kind of work with, collaborate with TSMC to build a factory in Europe. The collection of automobile companies putting their money down to build a factory there. So you're seeing some of that, and how far it will go is not clear, but you beginning to see some of that.
Talk about this company in Amsterdam or in Netherlands, ASML.
Mm-hmm.
They make a pretty fancy technology, right? Ultraviolet lithography.
Yeah.
That's well needed for a bunch of things, right? Talk about that
That's
company's history.
A technology marvel. If you go into the details of how this machine, the EUV machine, extreme ultraviolet lithography machine, is really an engineering marvel. Now, it is also a statement about two things. One, it's a statement about a global supply chain. The laser come from San Diego. The lens is polished in Germany. The mechanical movement came from Connecticut. So it's not just the Netherlands. It's a global supply chain of not only the machine parts itself, but also the knowledge, a global supply chain of knowledge. That's one. The other one is an example of open science. The first EUV papers were published in the late 80s by a group at Bell Labs, and then followed by a bunch of conferences in which researchers in Japan and in Europe all participated. And those and then the US national labs participated in the development of the early prototypes in the Department of Energy, the national labs. All these, and then companies start coming in, Intel, TSMC, and so on, and start investing. And we're talking about global companies, right, not just one country, global companies investing in it. And years later, 30-some years later, or maybe 40-some years later, you have this wonderful machine. And that's all coming from a global collaboration of researchers, generating knowledge, sharing the knowledge, and bootstrapping from themselves. And that's a very important lesson for us to learn, is that if you cordon yourself off from the rest of the world, you wouldn't be able to achieve that. Or even if you are able to do that, it will take a much longer time, and you lose the window of opportunity. That's a very important lesson to learn in this day and age of geopolitical tension, and everybody wants to kind of have everything to themselves and not sharing with each other. If you don't share, you don't gain. You gain back more than we share. I think that's basically how I would characterize it.
You breed a sense of optimism just by way of how the intertwining of different stakeholders in multiple countries. You seem to suggest that serves as a structural cohesive force for that to be it's very difficult to rip it apart.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And if you do rip it apart, you lose.
Everybody loses.
Everybody loses. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody loses.
But, given the fact that we're seeing so much political neurosis in many parts of the world, yes, right? Sometimes people don't act rationally.
Yes.
They act based on what their heart tells you, not what their brain tells you. Isn't that a risk?
Yes, there's a risk. I think in some parts, I think it's due to the lack of understanding rather than any bad intent. It's not because somebody's bad intention or anything like that, but I think it's more like a lack of understanding. I came to that observation through my participation in a study from the Hoover Institution about 2 years ago. They had a study about U.S., China, Taiwan, and semiconductors. And they published, after 2 years, they published a report called Silicon Triangle. You can go on the Hoover website and download it. And through that participation, I understand, my observation is that many of the people in the policy circle, they don't understand the technology.
Yeah.
Therefore, because of this lack of understanding, they would make policy that really doesn't make sense from a technology. If you do have this technology underpinning, it doesn't make sense. Now, it doesn't mean that the people making policy meant bad or anything like that. It's just a lack of understanding. And it also doesn't mean that the people making policy are dumb or anything like that. It's not. Nobody understands everything under the world, right? Today, they may be making policy about the pandemic, and tomorrow they may be making policy for semiconductor chips, and the next day maybe nuclear arms, right? So there's no way anybody, any single person or even a group of persons can understand everything under the world, right? But I think policymaking would really be helped if there are more people who have domain expertise are participating in the formulation of the policy. And today, I think we have very few people who understand, at least in the semiconductor space that I'm familiar with, who are materially participating in the formulation of the policies. And I think that is a big hole that we need to fill.
Do you suggest a higher degree of cultural interaction?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Right? I get the sense that people are not spending enough time in each other's places.
Absolutely, yeah. Right? Like I said, while I was participating in this Hoover study, many of them are policy people, China experts, and so on. And at the end of the study, we all understand a little bit more about what the other people are experts about. I didn't know anything about China policy or industrial policy before, but I have at least some introductory understanding about it by now. And my colleagues likewise have some introductory understanding about semiconductors. They wouldn't ask the question, why not a full conductor anymore?
I had to ask you that. and I gotta ask you, what's the difference between oil and chips? I know you've been asked that. What's the difference between oil and chips?
What's the difference between oil and chips? Yeah, that's right.
I mean, people have been saying chips is the new oil.
Yeah. So I participated in this Hoover Institution study, and a lot of people say, chips, we need chips, and chips are everywhere. Anything that you need to turn on the power, have a battery in it, or plug into a wall, involves some kind of a chips. You roll up your car window, there's a chip. You listen to a podcast, you need a chip. Everything is a chip. So it's like commodity. It's like oil. We need oil. We need fossil fuel, right? So people make a comparison between oil and chips, and that comparison is pretty prevalent in a policy circle.
Right.
Okay. Now,
but it's misplaced.
I think it's totally misplaced. And when I made that comment at the study, and people look at me and say, "Oh yeah, okay, why is it different?" Chips are a lot like oil because oil has been in the ground for millions of years. It never change. You dig it up today, you dig it up tomorrow, it's the same oil. The method of digging may be different, but the oil is the same. Chips are not. You have phones, you have watches, you have your TVs. Would you like to use a phone that was made 20 years ago? Would you like to watch a TV that was made 20 years ago? You don't, because chips constantly advance, and it has to constantly advance to show its value. People expect chips to continuously advance in its capability. Capability broadly defined as in amount of things, the kind of things that they can do, and also energy efficiency. Don't burn up so much energy or power. Don't use up that much battery power, and so on. So the chips is useful to us because it's valuable to us because it advances constantly. It constantly renews itself. Chips today is different from chips tomorrow. You want the chips tomorrow, not the chips of yesterday. Now, oil, it's not the same. You can stockpile oil, no doubt. And America does that. Many countries do that too. You don't stockpile chips. A stockpile that you have is not useful very soon.
Every couple of years, they're going to be obsolete.
Yeah, every couple of years, obsolete. Yeah, exactly.
Is it feasible to attain chip sovereignty or an absolute chip sovereignty?
Given the nature that we just talked about, the global nature. I know,
I'm imagining.
It's not possible. It's not possible. I think whoever suggests that put in a policy circle is probably not having enough understanding about how the thing works.
Then I got to ask you the following question. In the worst case scenario, where we're seeing some unintended consequence or episode, happening in the Taiwan Straits, what would happen?
Well, let me quote two sources. One, according to a McKinsey report, it will be worse than the pandemic economically. Second, you probably have seen the interview on TV of the TSMC chairman, Mark Liu. Question was posed to him by the reporter. And I would like to quote his response. Say, if such a thing happened, you have more things to worry about than just chips. Just make sure that it doesn't happen.
I'll pray.
Let's make sure it doesn't happen.
Well, we've talked a lot. Any final messages, Philip, to people in Southeast Asia or anywhere around the world so that they can feel more optimistic about they're becoming much more, positive and constructive about attaining STEM capabilities, hopefully some sort of manufacturing capabilities too, and being able to be collaborative with the rest of the world and all that?
Well, one of the things that turned out to be a positive thing for kind of developing countries or countries who are interested in advanced manufacturing, generally speaking, not just chips, but advanced manufacturing, is that because of the renewed sense of sensitization to supply chain resiliencies and so on, there is more of a diversification effort going on right now, that these countries who are historical in the past haven't really participated in this space have a great opportunity right now. And that means they need to be prepared to take this opportunity that is opening up to them. And that means, taking from the Taiwan experience that I mentioned to you, that we discussed earlier, that means talent cultivation and government policy to support it, and general society, local society to support it. In terms of talent, by the way, a lot of people talk about workforce development. Yep. I actually don't like that word that much. I like to call it talent cultivation, because it's really talent, not just workers who repeatedly do the same thing, but really people who can continually learn and try do new things and understand the things what they're doing and be able to improve on it. Those are what talent would do, right? Not just generally workforce in the traditional sense of the word. And the other aspect is this general society support of the industry. I'll give you another interesting story. TSMC wanted to build a new factory in Hsinchu, in the place where they have a lot of factories. And the government zoned a piece of land for them. Unfortunately, there is a temple, a historical temple in that piece of land. I read about this in the newspaper. Right? So, and of course, temple is sacred, and nobody wants to move the temple. But then, at the end of the day, they decided that, okay, I can relocate the temple for you. That's an important statement about how the general society support the economic development.
They know where the priorities are.
They know where the priorities are, right? And that's a really strong statement to support the society.
Let me ask you, with the benefit of hindsight, if there wasn't a meeting between Morris Chang and a public official who had the authority and also the vision, well, both of them had a vision, right? Would there be a TSMC?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps. I mean, history developed the way it is because of certain events, certain people, right?
It's serendipitous.
Yeah, it's really, there's a Chinese saying that whether it's the situation that created the hero or the hero that created the situation, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit of both. Right? Even if there is an official who started a conversation with a certain person, if that person is not astute enough, then there's nothing's going to happen. Or if there's a very visionary person, but there's no corresponding government official who sees things the same way, nothing's going to happen. I think it's a little bit of both. And I think it's a little bit of both. And earlier you asked about any lessons about Southeast Asian countries. I think there's also a lesson to be learned in the U.S. as well. In the U.S., we talk about onshoring manufacturing. To me, it sounded like giving a fish to somebody.
Yeah.
You haven't taught them how to fish.
I agree.
Right, and that's important to understand. And the other thing is manufacturing and innovation or R&D, research and development, go hand in hand. Manufacturing is not just doing repeatedly the same thing to a recipe. There's a lot of innovation on the manufacturing floor, how to improve on the manufacturing process, how do you get better yield, how do you turn the current generation of technology a little bit better so that you can offer a newer version of this technology based on this current one. Just slight change, not big change, but slight change that provide value to your customer. How do you do that? And TSMC does that a lot. Every generation, they will come up with innovation on the manufacturing floor that turn it into a product that's slightly better than the previous one, that brings the customer in. You can tell the customer, hey, for a small price increase, you could get much better performance or energy efficiency or better cost that doesn't require you to go to the next jump. That's value to the customer.
Yeah.
So the manufacturing and research and development and innovation really go hand in hand.
Yeah.
That's one piece, one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is that research and development has to be really close to manufacturing. Otherwise, you're dreaming up with solutions that not manufacturable. And how do you know what is manufacturable or not?
Yeah.
By being very close to the manufacturing floor. So in other words, it is very difficult to have the research and development divorced from the manufacturing. And so if we just say, hey, company X, just come to Ohio, Arizona, Texas, whatever, and build your fab, that's, I think, just basically isolate that so-called manufacturing from the rest of it. It's not going to be successful.
You got to be cognizant of the inseparability of the two components. Those are two sides of the same coin.
Those are two sides of the same coin. You cannot just say, I only bring manufacturing onshore and I don't do the R&D, and that's very important. So in other words, all these chips subsidies of $52 billion of the CHIPS Act, right? 39 billion goes to the manufacturing subsidies and 11 billion go to R&D.
Should be flipped.
Well, it may not be flipped because it takes more effort, more money to do the manufacturing, but the importance of which is flipped.
The R&D.
The most important one is the $11 billion. If you do that part right. I'm saying that not because I'm an academic, I do research, right? But if you don't do
I would
this
even
right,
put a greater number for R&D.
Exactly.
Than 11.
Right. That has to be done right. Otherwise, you'll get a fish and you ate that fish and then that's it.
You got to teach the fishermen how to fish.
Absolutely. And I think that is the most important thing. And for the fishermen to be successful, you need to be able to talk to other fishermen.
Yeah.
You know where, so that you know where the fish is.
Yeah. And you got to have a boat.
Yes, you can have a boat, yes.
You know, there has been a lot of rhetoric about friendshoring, reshoring, offshoring, right? In the last few years. But if you take a look at the empirical evidence, call it Southeast Asia, capital formation hasn't really moved up in a meaningful manner. And I would speculate or even hypothesize that a lot of that is because of the lack of investment on a human capital, right? And the onus is really upon us to get our act together. You know, there is a desire to reshore. There is a desire to relocate. But if we're not ready, you know, it's not going to come.
Yeah. Well,
and it hasn't come as much as we would have hoped for.
Yeah, to capture the opportunity, you need to be prepared. And this talent cultivation is really to be prepared. You look at China as an example. They graduate more engineers than anybody in the world.
Yeah.
And that's how they becomes a manufacturing hub of the world. And to go to Shenzhen, it's unbelievable. If you want to build something, some hardware, you got to be there.
Yeah.
They have not only the people, but also the infrastructure. And the people is really amazing. They know how to do things. And so you need that investment.